The house is quiet when it shouldn't be. I can feel the stillness before I open my eyes, the kind that sits on the air like dust, settling into the curtains, the carpets, the bones. Morning light pushes through the lace with a cold, strained glow, catching the frost on the window and the cracks in the wallpaper. Someone walked this hallway long before I woke. The floorboards still hold their warmth. In a Victorian home, silence is never emptiness. It's a signal, a warning, a story tightening beneath the surface. As I rise, the house breathes with me. Every room carries its own kind of ache. The drawing room where smiles were practiced, the nursery where no one cried aloud, the dining table where obedience sat heavier than the roast. The Victorians built their families like polished portraits, rigid, proper, airless. But behind every closed door lay something rawer. Punishments whispered, affections denied, reputations protected at any cost. Even the walls feel complicit, holding secrets between plaster and lath. And tonight, we go inside that world, into the shadows behind the etiquette books, behind the perfect daughters and dutiful sons, behind the fathers who ruled with silence and the mothers who drowned beneath expectation. The dark side of the Victorian family is not about what they showed, but what they hid. Subscribe and stay with me deeper into the hidden rooms, the heavy curtains, and the secrets Victorian families tried to bury. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past is never as distant as it seems. The floor meets you before the morning does, long before the lamps are trimmed or the curtains are drawn back. The boards beneath your feet hold the weight of what happened here and what was never spoken aloud. In a Victorian house, the floor is the first witness and the last confessor. It creaks in soft, uncertain notes, the way an old violin does when someone tests the strings before a sorrowful song. Each sound rises like breath from the timber, as if the wood still remembers the footsteps it once carried, hurried ones, careful ones, frightened ones. When you step onto the landing, the boards give a low groan, settling under your weight. They have always done that, but today, the sound feels different, heavier, aware. The grain of the wood glows faintly in the thin winter light, revealing long, pale scratches that never quite polished out. No one in the family mentioned them, no servant dared ask. But the floor knew, it always knew. The mornings in this house were not gentle ones. Doors opened not to warmth, but to expectation, a kind of pressure that lived beneath every polished surface. And beneath it all, layer after layer, the floorboards absorbed every tremor and every unsteady breath. Somewhere below, in the hall, you can almost hear the echo of a night many years ago, a single hurried run across the boards, followed by a door closing too fast. That sound still lingers in the grain, trapped like a memory pressed between pages. The Victorians believed in the moral weight of a home, in the way behavior seeped into the walls and floors as surely as soot from the streets. If that was true, then this house is heavy with the lives that shaped it. Every board feels bowed with the strain. You move toward the staircase, placing each foot carefully, as though you might disturb whatever sleeps here. The railing is cool under your hand. The air smells faintly of coal dust and lavender water, the evening scent lingering long after the servants cleared the hearth. Below you, the staircase curves into shadow, each step soft with the imprint of those who once walked quietly to avoid waking anyone. Silence, in this home, was not peace. It was survival. A far-off memory pulses through the planks, the sharp crack of a boot heel, the hush that followed, the way even the gas lamps seemed to dim themselves. Someone once controlled this house simply by walking through it, and the boards still brace, even now, as though expecting that familiar tread. That is the nature of Victorian walls and floors, to hide the truth publicly and hold it privately. You continue downward, each creak sounding almost like speech. If you listen carefully, it feels as though the house is telling you everything it was never allowed to say out loud. The boards whisper of footsteps late at night, a child seeking comfort, a mother who did not sleep, a servant summoned too softly for the neighbors to hear. They whisper of mornings when the tension was so thick that no one dared breathe until the sun reached the window. They whisper of nights where a hush fell, suddenly a hush that was not natural. By the time you reach the bottom of the stairs, the floor has settled again. The house grows still, as though exhausted from remembering. You stand in the dim hallway, knowing the truth sits beneath your feet, layered in wood, pressure, and years. Victorian families loved to show polished facades, but the floors always told the real story. And tonight, they have begun to tell it again. The parlor waits behind its door like a held breath. Even before you touch the handle, you feel the way the house tightens around it, walls drawing closer, air turning still, shadows collecting in the corners as if preparing for something unspoken. Every Victorian home had such a room, the one meant for company, for performance, for perfection. Yet, in this house, the unlocked rooms feel safer than this one, locked gently, deliberately, with a key that never left the master's pocket. You pause outside it, sensing the faint draft slipping under the heavy threshold. It smells of rose water and old dust scents, preserved almost too carefully, like artifacts. No one has crossed this doorway in months, maybe years, yet the carpet beneath your feet is worn, as though someone once paced here often, back and forth, in a rhythm edged with worry. The lock itself bears scratches, tiny crescents where a trembling hand once tried to turn it quietly, hoping not to be heard. The marks were never polished away. In the morning hush, the house feels braced, as though listening to your hesitation. The parlor's door has a way of unsettling even silence. Victorian families curated rooms like stage sets, each space arranged to suggest refinement, stability, virtue. But the parlor is different here. It was not just a place to entertain, it became a repository for things that should not have been seen. Arguments halted mid-sentence when guests arrived. Disappointments dressed in lace, tears wiped away before crossing the threshold. The door, more than any servant or parent, became the keeper of appearances. You run your fingers along the wood. It is flawlessly varnished, its sheen unbroken except for a faint circular stain near the bottom water, perhaps, or something spilled in haste. The thought lingers. What did the room witness? What was so neatly hidden? Behind this door, furniture stands exactly as it did decades ago. A fainting couch angled toward a window no one opened, a marble-topped table with a missing corner no one mentioned, and an embroidered rug that muffled more than footsteps. For a moment, the house feels too quiet. Victorian families often kept their parlors closed, not to preserve them, but to conceal the echoes inside. The room might still hold the hush of a mother's sob before she gathered herself for dinner, or the low thud of something dropped, a letter, a locket, hope. The air presses against your palm like a memory trying to rise. You imagine the last time this door was opened. Perhaps a servant slipped into dust, her feet careful on the pattern of the rug, her breath held as she touched objects that did not belong to her world. Perhaps the master entered alone, checking that nothing lay out of place, that no trace of the night before lingered where guests might notice. Or perhaps it was a child, braver than fear allowed, who turned the knob just enough to peek inside before footsteps sent them running. The door remains locked now, the key long missing or purposefully hidden. But the room behind it is not silent. You can almost feel it pressing outward, filled with whatever truths the family could not bear to carry openly. Victorian homes were immaculate, but they were not innocent. The parlor, with its velvet drapes and rigid chairs, absorbed every shattered moment disguised beneath etiquette. You step back at last, the floor sighing quietly under your weight. The locked door stands unchanged, but you feel altered, as if the house has taught you something about the quiet cost of maintaining perfection. Behind that polished surface lies a history too delicate to display, but too heavy to truly hide. And the house, patient and watchful, knows you will return to it. The nursery door stands half open, as though the room never learned how to close itself properly. Victorian nurseries often carried an air of innocence, painted toys, lace-edged curtains, the faint sweetness of starch and soap. But when you step inside this one, the silence presses in immediately, soft and strange, like the hush of a church before a confession. Everything here feels small except the quiet, which stretches to the corners in long, uneasy folds. You move slowly, your feet sinking into a faded rug scattered with toys older than the house's current occupants. A wooden horse with chipped paint stands frozen mid-gallop. A doll with glassy, unblinking eyes rests on a chair, too straight back to ever be comfortable. These objects should belong to the free, bright world of childhood. Instead, they sit stiffly, as though waiting for permission to be touched. Even the sunlight filtering through the draped window seems hesitant, falling in thin, wary lines. Victorian. Children were taught to be seen but not heard. But in this house, the rule went deeper. They learned to whisper before they learned to walk. You can almost hear them, tiny voices pressed to each other's ears, sharing secrets under blankets, rehearsing their steps for the day like performers too young to understand the script. The slightest slip of sound could draw unwanted attention, and so they shaped their words into the smallest possible form. Whispering became survival. There are faint marks on the wall near the wardrobe, tiny scratches made by restless fingers or a toy dragged too close. They speak of children trying to create small worlds of their own in the narrow margins allowed to them. A dollhouse sits near the corner, its miniature rooms meticulously arranged. Each room a softer imitation of the real house, and yet somehow more honest. The tiny chairs are slightly askew, the beds unmade, as though the children allowed their dolls the disorder they were denied. You kneel beside the window seat and run your hand over the cushion. It yields slightly, revealing the impression of countless hours spent sitting here quietly, hands folded, voices lowered. This was the vantage point from which children watch the outside world, the lamplighter in the street, the neighbor's dog, the seasons changing without sound. If they pressed their faces to the glass too eagerly, a warning cough from downstairs would remind them to withdraw. A faint memory clings to the air, sharp and almost audible, a child's breath caught in their throat when footsteps approached the door. The children here did not fear the dark. They feared being too loud in the light. Lessons about silence began early. Do not interrupt, do not question, do not cry where anyone can hear. Even joy was muted, softened into polite laughter taught by their governess, who herself lived in the delicate balance between obedience and invisibility. You walk to the small bed in the corner. Its quilt is neatly folded, the pillow perfectly plumped. But when you lay your hand upon it, the fabric whispers with leftover warmth, the kind that lingers from nights spent stiff with worry. Victorians believed strictness built character, but in homes like this one, it built something else entirely, a quiet that lasted into adulthood, a habit of swallowing emotions whole. Standing again, you feel the weight of the nursery settle onto your shoulders. Childhood should echo with giggles and wild stories, but here it echoes only with restraint. The children who lived in this room learned to whisper not because they were mischievous, but because they were afraid of breaking the fragile order the adults depended on. As you step back into the hallway, the faintest draft brushes past you like the memory of a child slipping through the shadows, careful not to be heard. The morning light touches the drawing room first, but it reaches her last. She sits at the small escritoire near the window, hands folded in her lap, posture perfect enough to satisfy any visitor, though no visitor ever calls this early. Her eyes, however, betray her. They carry the dull sheen of someone who has slept poorly for too many years, someone whose weariness has settled into her bones like damp settling into old wallpaper. Victorian mothers were expected to be the moral center of the home, calm, graceful, and endlessly composed. But you can feel the strain in the air around her, the quiet effort it takes simply to remain upright. The room is already warm from the fire the servants lit before dawn, yet a faint chill gathers around her chair, as if the house itself knows the heaviness she carries. She traces invisible lines on her skirt, tiny, precise movements, familiar with repetition. They are the gestures of someone who has learned to calm herself without ever being seen doing so. A cup of tea sits untouched beside her, steam long faded. You imagine her lifting it earlier, pausing as footsteps echoed on the landing, then setting it back down before the cup even touched her lips. She listens to the house the way a sailor listens to the sea, sensing every shift, every tremor. A mother in this era was responsible for harmony, yet had little control over the tides that shaped her family's life. Respectability was a delicate performance, and she its most fragile performer. Through the window, faint London fog curls along the street, and her eyes follow it with a longing that is almost visible. Victorian women were rarely permitted to want anything beyond their household, yet desire still found ways to lodge itself behind their ribs. She once dreamed of travel, perhaps, or books she was discouraged from reading too deeply, or simply a life where her emotions did not need to be arranged as carefully as the parlor ornaments. You look at her hands. The knuckles are slightly swollen, the skin faintly dry from the constant winter chill, though she would never complain. Her wedding ring looks heavier than gold should. On the table nearby lie letters tied neatly with ribbon correspondence she reads in private, each one opened with the same steady, resigned grace. Some bring news, others, reminders of duties she cannot escape. One envelope, tucked beneath the rest, bears a crease that suggests it was once clenched too tightly. The house holds its breath when she rises. Her skirt whispers across the carpet, a soft sound that carries years of habit smoothing arguments before they became storms, offering comfort in the smallest ways, holding back tears until she reached the privacy of her fainting room. She moves with the grace expected of her, but her shoulders slope under unseen weight. A Victorian mother was the family's anchor, but she was rarely anchored herself. In the hallway, she pauses, listening. Perhaps she hears her children whispering as they dress, or the servants beginning their morning tasks. Perhaps she listens for something sharper, the steady, authoritative tread of the man whose moods ruled the house more than any clock. Her expression tightens just slightly before smoothing back into practiced calm. As she descends the staircase, the boards creak beneath her, not loudly, but with a sound that feels almost sympathetic. They, too, remember every morning she walked them with tired eyes. They remember the nights she stood awake, long after the household slept, pressing her hand to the banister for support. Victorian mothers were praised for their composure, but the truth lies in the small, weary moments the world never bothered to see. In houses like this, a woman learned to survive by folding her exhaustion into silence, the same silence that moves with her now. Down the stairs, into another day she will endure with quiet grace. His presence reaches the room before he does. It drifts in like a change in weather, a subtle tightening of the air, a faint sting of tobacco, the heavy quiet that presses against the walls. The Victorian father was the pillar of the house, the moral steward, the final word. But in this home, he is something more, an atmosphere, a gravity. Every footstep he takes rearranges the silence itself. You hear him long before you see him. The slow, deliberate creak of the landing boards, the kind that never betray haste, only authority. His boots make a muted, orderly rhythm, measured with the precision of someone who expects the world to fall in step. Even the gas lamps seem to shrink their glow as he passes, their halos dimming with a kind of instinctive caution. He pauses outside his study, fingers brushing the polished brass handle. For a moment, his shadow spills across the hallway like spilled ink. The house holds its breath. Victorian fathers were taught to command respect, but this one commands something closer to fear, though no one would ever dare say the word aloud. His manner is calm, always calm, but it is the stillness of deep water, masking the currents beneath. The study door opens with a soft click. Inside, the air smells of paper, ink, and the faint char of last night's ash. The desk sits at the center like a judge's bench, perfectly ordered, each paper stacked with mathematical precision. He sits slowly, lowering himself as though settling into a throne. His chair groans once, then falls obediently silent. You watch as he uncaps his fountain pen. The sound is small, almost delicate, but even that carries authority. He writes steadily, with no wasted motion. Letters, ledgers, correspondences, any document that concerns the family's position or reputation must pass through his hands. In Victorian society, a father was the architect of appearances, and he treats that role as a sacred duty. The slightest hint of disorder would be an indictment. His jaw tightens as he reads a letter. A single furrow appears between his brows, the kind that makes the servants freeze mid-step, unsure whether to continue or retreat. He never raises his voice. He never needs to. The quiet around him sharpens instead, becoming the reprimand his children fear the most. They have learned to read the angle of his shoulders, the set of his mouth, the exact moment to lower their gaze. Somewhere in the hallway, a soft clatter echoes a dropped object, small but ill-timed. He lifts his head, just slightly, just enough. The sound disappears into a sudden, suffocating hush. This is how he rules. Not with outbursts, but with expectation. Not with rage, but with precision. His presence fills each corridor like a standard set, too high for anyone to reach. You look closer at him now. The lines around his eyes are not merely stern. They are tired in their own way, etched by pressure he refuses to acknowledge. His father likely ruled the same way. And his father before that. Generations of men shaped to believe control was the proof of their worth. The strictness they inherited became the strictness they inflicted. The cycle was never questioned, only repeated. He stands at last, every movement a silent command. When he leaves the room, the study exhales the slightest shift of curtains, the soft release of tension in the floorboards, but the echo of him remains, clinging to the air like scent or smoke. In Victorian homes, the father was the law, but in this house, he became something larger, a presence woven into the walls themselves. And as he descends the stairs, each step measured, each breath controlled, the entire house aligns itself once more around the quiet weight of him. Before the family stirs, the servants are already awake. Dawn slips through the rear windows long before it reaches the grand rooms upstairs, and in that dim, muted light, the household breathes differently. The servants' corridor smells faintly of coal dust, damp linens, and the metallic tang of early morning air. Here, footsteps are quick but quiet. Voices stay low, soft as cloth brushing against cloth. It is a world beneath the world, hidden, necessary, always watching. You walk along the narrow passage, feeling the boards dip slightly under your weight. These planks know a different rhythm than the floors above. They carry the tread of tired feet, the urgent shuffle of someone summoned too abruptly, the cautious pace of a maid listening for trouble. Victorian servants were trained to be invisible, but invisibility had a price. They saw what no one else was meant to see. A maid's apron hangs on a hook near the scullery door, its corner still damp from yesterday's washing. You can picture her standing there in the early hours, her hands red from scrubbing, her eyes heavy but alert. She would know the family's moods before the family even did. She learned to read the tension in the father's gait, the tremor in the mother's sigh, the whispered conspiracies of the children. In this house, the servants witnessed everything. They heard the arguments muffled through thick walls, the stifled cries behind locked doors, the sighs of exhaustion that slipped out only when the lamps were dimmed. Their work carried them into every room, clearing hearths, folding sheets, dusting shelves, replacing candles. They touched the objects the family prized, and the ones they hid. You pause by the back staircase, steeper and narrower than the front one. These steps sag in the middle, worn by years of movement, the quiet, relentless labor that kept the house functioning. A servant once tripped here, perhaps, catching herself on the railing, heart pounding as she listened for the master's approach. She would have feared not injury, but disappointment, reprimand. dismissal. Victorian service left no room for error. The kitchen below hums faintly. The early scrape of a knife, the soft clatter of crockery, the whistle of boiling water. Down there, the servants gossip in murmurs, sharing the truths they pretend not to know. They have seen the mother slip into her fainting room with eyes already wet. They have seen the father shut his study door more forcefully than he means to. They have seen the children flinch when a floorboard creaks in the wrong place. Yet they speak of these things only in coded fragments, phrases like "a long night" or "a troubled mood." In Victorian households, truth belonged to no one but the servants, and they carried it carefully, like a teacup filled to the brim. One spill could cost everything. You move toward the servants' bedrooms, where narrow cots sit beneath slanted ceilings. The blankets are thin, the air too cold. But here lies the only place where the servants could let out a sigh without fear of reprimand. This is where they stored their exhaustion, their small joys, their worries about wages and winter and the world beyond the house they served. But even here, the family's presence lingered. A cough upstairs meant footsteps downstairs. A raised voice meant a hurried response. The servants lived on the edge of every sound. As you step back into the corridor, the house seems to tighten again, the day beginning, the expectations rising. The servants straighten their aprons, adjust their caps, and return to invisibility, carrying with them the quiet burden of knowing too much. Their eyes flick toward the stairs leading up to the grand rooms, bracing for whatever the family's morning will bring. Because in houses like this, the servants did not just witness the family's secrets, they kept the house from collapsing under the weight of them. The morning arrives muted, as if the light itself has been warned to tread softly. The curtains in the front parlor remain drawn, thick velvet panels that usually greet the day with practiced grace. Today they hang stiff and unmoving, their folds heavy with something unsaid. In a Victorian household, closed curtains signaled more than a darkened room. They signaled disturbance. Respectability dimmed on purpose. You stand in the hallway, sensing how the house feels different. The air carries a faint tension, like a note held too long on a violin string. Even the dust motes seem reluctant to drift through the stillness. The servants pass by slowly, their movements controlled, their glances brief. They know better than to ask why the curtains never opened. They know the meaning of a room deliberately kept in shadow. When you enter the parlor, the darkness greets you like a confession. The air is cool, almost cold, carrying the faint smell of yesterday's extinguished coal fire. The heavy drapery muffles the city outside. The distant clip of hooves, the murmur of morning voices, the turning of carriage wheels, all softened, all far away, as if the house has chosen to close itself off from the world. The closed curtains mean something happened last night, something the family intends to hide. The furniture stands rigid, every chair in its proper place, every porcelain figurine arranged meticulously. But the rug along the hearth is slightly crooked, shifted by a foot that moved too quickly or too forcefully. The coal scuttle sits open, as though someone fed the fire late in frustration or fear. These small displacements speak in a language only the house understands. You touch the curtain's edge. The fabric is thick beneath your fingers, lined with dust in its folds from too many days of immaculate order. When you tug it gently, no light breaks through. It is pinned shut from the inside, a careful, deliberate act. Victorian families sometimes close their curtains in mourning, but this house mourns something else. Turmoil, shame, or simply a night that should not be seen. A faint imprint catches your eye on the fainting couch, the shallow depression where someone sat too long or curled into themselves. The cushion's surface bears a single crease, the mark of a hand pressed down for steadiness. Someone was here last night, in the dark, seeking refuge from something that moved through the house like an unspoken storm. You imagine the scene, the mother slipping quietly into the room while the rest of the house slept, curls loosened from their pins, hands trembling as she tried to gather herself. Or perhaps the father entered first, pacing in heavy silence, the weight of his temper still vibrating through the floorboards. Perhaps the children hid beneath their blankets, listening for the sound of his voice or the absence of it, which was often worse. A single kerosene lamp rests on the side table, its wick charred black. It burned. Late. Too late. The faint scent of smoke clings to the lampshade, a ghost of restless hours. Lamps like that were often the only witness to private grief, their flicker too gentle to expose a family's unraveling. You move closer to the window. The curtains do not stir, even when the floorboard sighs beneath you. Outside, the world continues as always, milkmen, merchants, neighbors pretending not to notice the drawn drapes. In Victorian society, no one asked questions when a family chose to dim its windows. It was considered polite, merciful, convenient. Inside, the dark feels like a boundary, a shield, a warning. Whatever happened in this room last night, a quarrel whispered through clenched teeth, a confession spoken in halting breaths, a fear that finally took shape. The curtains were closed to protect the family from the world, and to protect the world from knowing the truth. As you leave the parlor, the darkness follows you only to the threshold, stopping where the hallway light begins. Behind you, the curtains remain shut, guarding the remnants of a night the house is determined not to reveal. The morning settles over the house like a thin grey shawl. It does not brighten the rooms, it merely reveals their stillness. You step into the family corridor, the one lined with framed photographs posed in stiff, joyless symmetry, and the absence of sound is immediate, almost physical. Victorian homes often prided themselves on order, but in this house, order has become a silence that clings to every corner. You pause at the threshold of the breakfast room. The long mahogany table is set with precision, cutlery aligned, napkins folded tightly, porcelain gleaming faintly in the low light. It should feel elegant, but instead the arrangement resembles a stage prepared for actors who have forgotten their lines. Even the chairs seem hesitant to scrape against the floor, as though the slightest noise would be considered a breach of conduct. Laughter does not live here. It once tried, perhaps in small attempts, in fleeting bursts, but over time it thinned, cracked, and finally dissolved into the same quiet that coats the window panes. Victorian families often believed that too much levity was unseemly, a sign of loosened morals. In this house, that belief hardened into a rule. Smiles became rare, measured things. Joy required justification. You look to the head of the table, where the father sits each morning with his newspaper folded in deliberate halves. His presence, calm and controlled, acts like a weight on the room. He is not cruel, not openly. He simply expects discipline. He expects composure. He expects children who speak only when called upon, who sit with straight backs and steady hands, who do not giggle or squirm or allow childish brightness to spill into the air. The children learned quickly, whispered lessons in restraint, practiced under the watchful eyes of their governess. A dropped spoon meant a sharp look. A laugh at the wrong moment meant an afternoon relegated to the nursery with the curtains drawn. Even the mother sits at the table, with her expression arranged as carefully as her tea service, offering polite murmurs instead of warmth. Her eyes flick occasionally toward the children, as if checking whether they breathe too freely. A faint clink breaks the hush. It is only the gentle touch of porcelain against saucer, but it startles the room like thunder. The youngest child freezes mid-motion, their spoon suspended inches above the bowl. The mother exhales quietly, a soft attempt at reassurance. The father does not speak. He simply lowers the edge of his newspaper just enough for his gaze to appear above it. His silence has the sharpness of a reprimand, and just like that, the room tightens again. You step back, letting the hallway swallow you. The house feels hollow, its beauty flattened by an unyielding decorum. The wallpaper blooms with ornate patterns, but none of them seem alive. The carpets muffle every sound, but they also muffle every feeling. Even the grandfather clock ticks with a subdued rhythm, as if trying not to disturb anyone. Victorian families often imagined laughter as something frivolous, something that could crack the polished veneer of respectability. Here, laughter became a forbidden luxury, one the children forgot how to create, and the adults forgot how to receive. The house did not simply lose joy, it unlearned it. As you drift toward the stairs, the quiet deepens, stretching like a long corridor. No giggles echo from behind the nursery door. No spontaneous chatter spills from the parlor. The house holds its stillness like a vow, and in that stillness, you can almost hear what laughter would have sounded like: bright, warm, impossible. But here, it remains only an echo of something the family never allowed to grow. Her room rests at the far end of the upper hallway, the quietest corner of the house. Victorian daughters were often placed there, tucked away from the noise, from temptation, from the world they were expected to face only after perfection had been sewn into every gesture. When you step inside, the air feels gentler, but not freer. It is the gentleness of pressed flowers, beautiful, preserved, and unable to move. The daughter's writing desk sits beneath the window, small and immaculate. A lace cloth drapes across it like frost, and atop it lies a stack of copybooks filled with neat loops of ink. Her handwriting is flawless, the practiced script of a girl taught that elegance must be effortless, even when it costs her sleep. The pen rests precisely parallel to the ledger, as though she placed it down with breathless care. On the bed, a single dress is laid out for the morning, pale blue, carefully brushed, the stitching so tight it nearly refuses to bend. Victorian daughters wore their unease the way they wore corsets, invisibly, obediently, with bruises hidden beneath cotton. You can imagine her standing before the mirror, turning slowly while her mother adjusted the hem, her voice soft with the constant instruction to behave, be still, be good. A faint indentation near the headboard tells you she sat there last night, perhaps for hours. The pillow holds the subtle crease of worry, the sort pressed by a forehead leaning forward in thought. In households like this, daughters learned early that emotions should be folded neatly, tucked away like handkerchiefs. Anything unbecoming, too loud, too honest, too hopeful, had to be stitched shut. Her bookshelf reveals hints of rebellion. Beneath volumes of etiquette and moral instruction lies a thin novel slipped slightly out of place, as though returned hastily. Its pages are worn at the corners. She must have read it hidden beneath her covers, straining to catch each line before footsteps approached. The door. Stories were her only escape words, offering glimpses of lives where girls made choices rather than surviving expectations. You touch the arm of the dressing chair. The wood is smooth from years of quiet preparation, brushing hair until it shone, fastening buttons with trembling fingers, rehearsing the silence expected of her. Victorian daughters were raised for futures already chosen: marriage, propriety, decorum. Yet this room holds the tension of a young woman who longs for something else, though she cannot name it aloud. A small trinket box sits on the nightstand. Inside, you find a ribbon, a dried sprig of lavender, and a folded piece of paper. When you open it, the pencil lines reveal the beginnings of a sketch, a landscape, perhaps, or the outline of an imagined life. The drawing is unfinished, as though she heard someone approaching and hid her dream before it could take shape. Outside the door, the hallway creaks softly, not loudly enough to alarm, just enough to remind her of where she stands in the hierarchy of the house. The father's rules, the mother's expectations, the servants' watchful eyes, they all press subtly against her, molding her into something compliant, polished, quiet. And so she endures, not with defiance, but with patience worn thin at the edges. She endures in the way she folds her dresses, in the way she answers softly even when her heart hammers, in the way she holds her thoughts like fragile china. As you leave her room, the faint scent of lavender follows you down the hall, delicate but persistent. It is the scent of endurance of a girl learning to survive by becoming smaller than her longing. In houses like this, the daughter was not simply taught to behave. She was taught to endure. His room is different from his sister's, larger but colder, less adorned but somehow heavier. Victorian sons were raised to inherit the name, the expectations, the future, yet in this house, the son inherited something else entirely. The emptiness that grows when no one looks closely enough. You step inside, and the air feels motionless, as though the room has been holding its breath for years. The curtains hang unevenly, not from neglect, but from a careless tug made in a moment of frustration. The carpet has a faint pattern worn thin where he paced, back and forth, a rhythm carved by thoughts too heavy for a boy his age. Victorian society adored sons in theory, but often failed them in practice. They were expected to be strong, stoic, unshakable, but no one taught them what to do with fear, or loneliness, or the quiet ache of being scrutinized only for achievement, never for emotion. His desk tells you more than his face ever would. Books stacked in, uneven towers, the spines strained, texts on mathematics, Latin, navigation chosen not by him but for him. Their pages are dog-eared, not from curiosity, but from pressure. A blot of ink stains the corner of one volume, dark and dense, as though the pen slipped in a moment he could not steady his hand. Above the fireplace hangs a portrait of him, painted 2 winters ago. The artist captured his height, his posture, his potential, but not his weariness. His eyes in the painting look alert, promising, full of the kind of ambition adults project onto young men, but the real boy behind it had shadows under his eyes even then. A pair of boots sits near the bed, one upright, the other on its side, frozen mid-fall. That toppled boot speaks louder than words. Mornings where he rose too quickly, nights where he collapsed without care. The bed itself is unmade, not messy, but restless. Sheets twisted, the pillow dented deeply at one corner, as though he sleeps curled inward, protecting something fragile. On the nightstand rests a small wooden box. You open it gently. Inside are fragments of a boyhood slipping away. A pressed coin, a broken compass, a marble with a chipped edge, relics from a simpler time before responsibility replaced imagination. But beneath those items lies something else, a scrap of paper torn from a notebook. The writing is small and uneven. Only a fragment of a sentence remains. If only I could. Nothing more. The rest was ripped away or never finished. That incomplete line hums like a quiet wound. You sense how invisible he has become. The father sees only the heir. The mother sees only the shape of the man he will one day be. The servants watch him, but they cannot speak. His sister whispers her worries through the nursery walls, but he never answers. Victorian sons were given everything except permission to unravel. A creak in the hallway breaks the stillness. He must be awake now, pushing open his door with the same controlled breath he uses to face each day. He moves quietly, not wanting to disturb, not wanting to disappoint. He carries the house's expectations like a weight across his shoulders, the kind that stoops him before he is fully grown. As you leave his room, a draft brushes past you, a soft, unsettled wind that slips through cracks in the window frame. It feels like the sigh of someone who has learned to suffer in silence, someone whose struggle remained invisible until the house itself began to mourn for him. He is the son no one watched closely enough, and the floorboards tremble with everything he never said. The portrait hangs in the central hallway, positioned so that no one can cross the house without passing beneath its gaze. Victorian families placed portraits where they could do the most work, overseeing, reminding, correcting. But this one does more than that. It lies. You stand before it, the morning light from the stairwell landing catching the varnish on its surface. The family sits arranged in perfect composition, father-centered, mother poised beside him, children symmetrically folded into the frame. Their faces are calm, their posture impeccable, their clothing rich with careful detail. It is the kind of portrait meant to declare stability, virtue, belonging, and none of it is true. Even from a distance, something feels wrong. The father's hand rests on the mother's shoulder, but the fingers look too stiff, as though he couldn't bear to touch her long enough for the artist to capture it. The mother's smile is pleasant, but the corners of her mouth strain upward while her eyes remain fixed, dim, searching elsewhere. The painter gave her warmth she did not possess, or was never allowed to show. The daughter stands to one side, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shine pale beneath the paint. The artist softened the tension, smoothing it into demure elegance, but you can still sense the pressure behind the gesture, years of being told to behave, to fold herself neatly into expectations. The son stands opposite her, back straight, chin lifted. He looks older in the painting than he is in life, as though the weight he carries settled early on his shoulders. His eyes meet yours with a strange, hollow intensity, not pride, but resignation. A boy molded into something that impresses strangers but suffocates him. The portrait is too perfect, too arranged, too symmetrical, to be honest. You move closer, leaning in until the scent of old oil paint and dust brushes your nose. Tiny cracks spider across the varnish, the first signs of the image, aging fissures that reveal how fragile the illusion has always been. The longer you look, the more the truth leaks through those cracks. Behind the father's composed brow is the temper that shakes the staircase railing. Behind the mother's soft expression are sleepless nights spent sitting alone in the dark parlor. Behind the children's stillness are whispers, bruised silences, and swallowed dreams. Portraits in Victorian homes did not capture truth. They buried it. You imagine the day it was painted, the family arranged in their stiff Sunday clothes, told to hold still, hold still, hold still. The daughter's foot tapping nervously before being scolded, the son's jaw tightening under the weight of expectation, the mother adjusting her bodice to hide the tremor in her hands, the father insisting on another sitting because he sensed something imperfect in the first. The artist, paid well, would have softened every edge, brightened every shadow. He would have smoothed the children's sorrow, replaced the mother's fear with poise, transformed the father's severity into dignity. A Victorian portrait did not reflect a family, it protected its reputation. As you step back, the house seems to recoil slightly, as if aware you've noticed the lie. The floorboards beneath the frame creak with a low, uneasy groan. The silence in the hallway deepens, heavy with unspoken things. Every guest admires the portrait when they visit. They praise the children's posture, the father's strength, the mother's grace. They leave believing they have seen the family clearly. But the house knows better. And now, so do you. The dining room awakens slowly, as if reluctant to participate in another day of ritualized performance. Even before the family enters, the room feels rehearsed. Chairs aligned by servants with careful precision, cutlery gleaming in symmetrical lines, the white tablecloth stretched so tightly it looks almost tense. Victorian dinners were not meals, they were ceremonies, and in this house, the ceremony ruled with quiet severity. You step inside, and the first thing you notice is the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The walls absorb every whisper, the carpet swallows the echo of footsteps. Only the grandfather clock in the corner keeps time, ticking with an unyielding authority, marking the seconds in a room where every gesture is observed. The table is already set for 6, though only 4 will sit today. The 2 empty spaces belong to absences no one is allowed to mention. A relative estranged, a child sent away, a story locked behind the same curtains that kept yesterday hidden. The silver domes covering the breakfast dishes reflect distorted fragments of the chandelier above, warped, stretched, glimmering like the family's own fractured reflections. You imagine the moment the family will gather. The father enters first, of course, his chair waiting at the head of the table like a throne carved from expectation. He rests his hand on the back of it briefly, a gesture that claims the entire room. The mother follows, smoothing her skirt, eyes downcast until she reaches her seat. She sits not with comfort, but with practiced composure, as though every meal is an examination. The children arrive last, guided by invisible rules. The daughter sits silently, folding her hands neatly in her lap, waiting for permission to breathe. The son glances at the father only once, long enough to calibrate his own posture. Here, Even knowing how to sit becomes an inherited chore. Victorian dining etiquette demanded restraint. No elbows on the table, no laughter above a low murmur, no questions unless invited, no glances exchanged that might suggest boredom, irritation, or longing. In this house, the rules twist even tighter. Forks lifted with perfect rhythm, napkins placed just so, conversation measured like the ticking clock. A single spoon slightly out of line would draw the father's gaze, a gaze that acts as reprimand. A cough might summon a raised eyebrow. A dropped utensil would create a silence so sharp it cuts through the linen. You move toward the sideboard, where a crystal decanter stands filled with watered wine. The glass is flawless, but a ring on the wood beneath it reveals a night when someone placed it down too hard. Too quickly, a crack in the facade that the servants noticed, cleaned, and never spoke of again. Victorian homes prized the illusion of control, and this table is its epicenter. The meal is less about nourishment and more about maintaining the fragile structure of the family's reputation, even when no guests are present. The father asks questions with the precision of a magistrate. The mother answers with politeness polished into submission. The children offer replies so careful they border on silence. And yet, even under this weight of etiquette, the room remembers moments when the ritual faltered. A chair pushed back too abruptly, a glass trembling in a hand that tried to hide its shaking, a whisper exchanged under breath, not rebellious, merely human. You can almost hear the memory of a night when a single sentence, spoken too honestly, shattered the stillness. The meal ended early that evening. The doors closed. The house grieved quietly. Now the table stands ready once more, waiting to enforce its rules, waiting to shape another meal into muted obedience, waiting to remind every family member that in this house, respectability is served first, and everything else is swallowed in silence. As you step away, the clock ticks again, steady, judgmental, relentless. The dinner table is set, and the rules are waiting. The nursery feels colder this morning, as though the night left something behind that the fire could not chase away. Victorian homes often spoke of illness with a kind of uneasy reverence, whispered warnings, bottles tucked discreetly into drawers, remedies steeped in secrecy. But illness in a child carried a different weight entirely, one that settled into the very walls of the room. You step inside, and a faint chill brushes your skin. The window is shut tight, yet the air feels drafty, unsettled. The toy horse near the hearth stands where it always does, but its shadow stretches across the rug in an odd, elongated shape, as if darkness itself leans toward the bed. Even the dolls look muted, their painted smiles dulled beneath a thin veil of dust. The room is familiar, but something in it has shifted. The small bed against the far wall is uncharacteristically rumpled, its coverlet pushed aside as though a restless hand struggled with fevered dreams. A damp cloth lies on the spica nightstand, its edges stiff with dried lavender water. Next to it sits a spoon on a saucer, the faint residue of medicine, staining the porcelain, a faint, sickly brown. Victorian tonics offered comfort in promise only. Their ingredients often brought more harm than relief. Laudanum, syrup of poppies, bitter compounds disguised with honey. You move closer, listening to the echoes that cling to the air. A cough once lingered here, sharp at first, then thin, then nothing at all as the child struggled to breathe quietly, so as not to alarm anyone. Children in houses like this learned early that illness was an inconvenience, something to be managed discreetly. Their suffering softened into silence. The governess's chair sits near the bed, pulled close enough for watchful nights. Its wooden arms bear faint scratches, the marks of anxious fingers gripping too tightly. She would have dozed there, head jerking awake each time the child stirred, torn between compassion and the fear of overstepping her boundaries. Victorian servants carried responsibility without authority, compassion without permission. The fire in the hearth is little more than ash now. You can almost picture the mother sitting beside it earlier, wringing her hands as she waited for the doctor's arrival. His footsteps would have echoed up the stairs, carrying the scent of carbolic soap and quiet judgment. Doctors of the era arrived with impressive confidence, but left disappointment behind more often than not. He would have examined the child briefly, offered reassurances that sounded like facts but were merely guesses wrapped in Latin. Perhaps he recommended fresh air, though the streets outside were thick with coal smoke. Perhaps he recommended tonics that dulled the senses but did nothing for the fever. Perhaps he simply advised patience, the most dangerous remedy of all. You glance at the small chamber pot beneath the washstand, at the blanket folded too neatly at the foot of the bed. These objects speak of a child trying to be good, even in sickness, holding still when every muscle trembled, whispering apologies for becoming ill at all. The house feels tender here, as though trying to protect its frail inhabitant. But there is something else too, a heaviness, like the held breath of a memory afraid to rise. Victorian families often believed illness was a test of moral character. Weakness reflected poorly. Recovery was expected. Grief was hidden, but the nursery remembers everything: the fevered nights, the soft whimpers stifled by blankets, the footsteps pacing in the hallway as the family waited for signs of improvement. You step back toward the doorway. The child is not here now, perhaps downstairs, wrapped in blankets, perhaps taken to another room, perhaps elsewhere entirely. But the sickness lingers in the corners, a quiet ghost woven into the fabric of the room. The nursery exhales as you leave, its silence deep and tender. It remembers the fever, it remembers the fear, and it remembers the child who tried so hard not to trouble anyone at all. The corridor narrows as you walk, the wallpaper darkening into muted florals, the kind chosen not for beauty but for concealment. This part of the house was never meant for visitors. It was designed for passing, not pausing a hallway that pretends not to hear what happens inside its rooms. Yet the walls here are thin, too thin, and the house has never mastered the art of silence. You stop near the middle of the passageway, where the floorboards dip slightly. From this point, sounds drift through the plaster with unsettling clarity. A faint rustle, a sigh, the soft thud of something set down too hard. Victorian builders prized elegance in public spaces, but they cut corners in private ones, leaving bedrooms and sitting rooms separated by walls no thicker than a book's spine. And behind such walls, nothing truly stayed hidden. You rest your hand on the wallpaper. Beneath the floral pattern, you feel a coldness that doesn't belong to temperature. It is the cold of absorption, the way plaster takes in years of whispered arguments, muffled sobs, frustrated breaths. The hallway carries them still, stored in its seams like trapped dust. To your left is the parents' bedroom. Last night, voices drifted through the wall, low, strained, cracking at the edges. Not shouts. Shouting would have been simpler. These were the quieter wounds, the ones inflicted with sighs and silence, the ones children pretended not to hear even as their hearts beat faster under the covers. The daughter's room is only a few feet away. She would have heard everything. Victorian daughters were trained to ignore the cracks in their family's facade, but thin walls taught them truths, etiquette never permitted. To your right lies the small sitting room where the mother sometimes retreats. The chair closest to the wall bears faint indentations in the cushion, as though she sat there often, listening without meaning to. The pressure of her posture remains stiff, braced, waiting for the moment when calm must be restored before anyone noticed its absence. Victorian mothers were expected to maintain harmony, even in households where harmony was impossible. As you continue down the hallway, the acoustics change subtly. You hear the echo of footsteps, the son's heavier tread, paced in anxious loops late at night. His room shares a wall with the father's study. Every time the father opened a drawer, every time he cleared his throat or struck a match, the sound carried through. The son learned the pattern of those sounds the way soldiers learn the rhythm of distant artillery. This was his battlefield. Thin walls, thick expectations. Farther down, near the servants' staircase, you hear remnants of different sounds, hurried whispers traded in the early hours, soft complaints swallowed quickly, The clatter of a dish dropped and immediately stifled beneath apologies. Servants lived closest to the truth, and thin walls gave them knowledge they never asked for, knowledge they carried with dangerous discretion. You pause near the end of the corridor, where a draught slips under a door frame. The wind outside rattles the window pane, and for a moment it resembles a quiet sob. The walls mimic it, a soft quiver, as though the house feels the tension it was built to hide. Victorian families valued discretion above honesty. They built homes with parlors meant to impress, staircases meant to elevate, and bedrooms meant to contain. But they forgot the walls, the frail boundaries that herd every suppressed emotion, every shame, every hope extinguished before it could rise. As you turn back toward the staircase, the thin walls seem to breathe with you. They feel almost alive, pulsing softly with the echoes they have held too long. In this house, secrets were never truly whispered. They traveled room to room, heart to heart, carried effortlessly through the walls that were never built quite thick enough. The fainting room sits at the back of the house, tucked between the master bedroom and the unused guest chamber. It is small, almost narrow, with one tall window that allows daylight to sift through in pale, filtered ribbons. Victorian homes often included such rooms for women's spaces meant for delicate nerves, for feminine constitution, for quiet collapse. But in this house, the fainting room is something else entirely. It is a refuge, a confessional, a cell. You open the door slowly. The hinges sigh, a tired sound that suggests they have been used at odd hours, late nights, early mornings, moments snatched between duties. Inside, the air is warm but stale, gently scented with rosewater and the faint medicinal sweetness of smelling salts. This is not a place made for guests. It is a place made for holding burdens no one else wanted to see. The fainting couch sits near the window, its upholstery slightly faded where hands have clutched the fabric. The imprint of the mother's body is still there, pressed into the cushions like the shadow of a long-held breath. You imagine her lying there, corset loosened, hairpins slipping free, chest rising too quickly, or not enough. A woman allowed to be fragile only when the door is closed. Beside the couch is a small table with a decanter of water and an etched glass, its rim showing faint marks from anxious thumbs. A silk handkerchief lies folded neatly beside it. Embroidered initials catch the light, delicate and precise. But the fabric is wrinkled, pressed repeatedly against tears that must never leave this room. Victorian motherhood came with unspoken expectations. To soothe, to calm, to carry burdens silently, to shield the world from the storms inside her own home. When those burdens became too heavy, she came here, not to faint but to breathe, to unravel, to gather the strength to hold her composure for another day. On the vanity sits a small mirror, its surface slightly cloudy. When you lean close, you see your reflection warped at the edges, as though the glass remembers every trembling gaze it has witnessed. A comb rests beside it, still tangled with a few strands of dark hair. Perhaps she pulled it through her hair too quickly last night, hands shaking, trying to smooth the tangled thoughts crowding her mind. The fainting room is quiet, but not empty. It carries the echoes of her breath when she tried to stifle sobs that threatened to break the delicate order of the house. It remembers the way her hands trembled when she clutched the edge of the couch. It remembers the way she pressed her forehead against the cool window pane, watching the street outside so close, so unreachable. Sometimes she came here after the father's voice grew sharp, sometimes after the daughter's tears slipped through that thin bedroom wall, sometimes after the son's quiet rebellion flickered too visibly. Other times, she came with no reason at all, exhaustion itself sufficient cause. This room was her sanctuary because it was the only place she was allowed to break. And even here, she broke quietly. You run your hand along the back of the fainting couch. The fabric is worn smoother than the rest, polished by years of gripping fingers and restless palms. The house did not give her freedom, but it gave her this room a place where she could let her mask slip just enough to breathe. When you turn to leave, The room seems to exhale, as though relieved to have its memories momentarily witnessed. The door closes softly behind you, and the hallway regains its stillness. But the fainting room holds its truth tucked behind its delicate curtains, preserved in the shadows where no one else dared look, a place where the mother could finally feel the weight she carried in a home that demanded she never show it. Her room sits between worlds, not among the servants' quarters, nor near the family bedrooms. It occupies the narrow space at the top of the secondary staircase, where the wallpaper fades into muted greens, and the ceiling slopes just low enough to remind her she does not truly belong. The governess lives in the in-between, the silent tether between childhood innocence and Victorian discipline. And in this house, that tether frays a little more each day. You open her door gently. The small room greets you with the faint scent of ink, chalk dust, and lavender soap. Her bed is neatly made, though the pillow bears a hollow dip, deeper than one night's rest should leave. She rarely sleeps well, not from overwork, which she accepts obediently, but from the constant vigilance her position demands. A governess in a Victorian household was both present and invisible, trusted and doubted, needed and yet kept carefully at arm's length. Her writing desk is cluttered with lesson books, Latin primers, geography atlases, moral instruction texts with gilded spines. But beneath them lies her own reading, a slim volume of poetry, its cover worn soft at the edges. She hides it beneath the arithmetic, embarrassed by her longing for something gentle in a house that insists on severity. On the wall hangs a slate board bearing faint marks that have not been fully erased. You run your hand across the surface. A few chalk strokes cling stubbornly, a crooked letter, a half-finished sum, a childish doodle of a horse. The daughter must have drawn it, perhaps in a moment of rare mischief. The governess likely scolded her softly, her voice trembling not with anger but with fear. Fear that kindness might be misinterpreted as weakness. For the governess fears her pupils more than she fears their parents. Victorian children were expected to be obedient, but these children have learned the subtler power of their social rank. A single complaint, even a fabricated one, could cost the governess her position. A raised eyebrow from the son, a quiet "Mother, she was unfair," a whispered accusation of favoritism. These things haunt her more than any raised voice. Her gloves lie on the bedside table, fingers curled as though they remember being clenched. Next to them rests a small bottle of spirits of hartshorn, a remedy for faintness she must pretend she does not need. The daily strain presses too heavily, correcting handwriting while ignoring the tremble in her own, smoothing emotional storms she must never acknowledge. You imagine her teaching in the schoolroom, voice steady but never sharp. She corrects mistakes gently, careful not to provoke resentment. She praises without enthusiasm, cautious not to seem overly familiar. Her every movement is measured, a delicate balancing act performed on a tightrope drawn across class lines. Sometimes, when the father enters unexpectedly, the room stiffens. The children straighten. The governess rises too, quickly, anxious to appear both competent and deferential. His gaze appraises her like an object necessary, yet replaceable. She knows this. The house reminds her daily. Yet she fears the daughter more than him. The daughter watches everything. The cracks in her voice, the tightening of her jaw, the moments when fatigue makes her slump. Children sense weakness the way animals sense storms, and the daughter, shaped by silent expectations, understands precisely how fragile the governess's place truly is. At night, when the rest of the house sinks into uneasy sleep, the governess remains awake. She sits at her desk, quill hovering over paper, writing letters she never sends, apologies, pleadings, dreams she does not permit herself to speak aloud. Her candle burns low, casting a thin halo of golden light around her hunched silhouette. She fears her pupils because they hold her fate in their small, careful hands. She fears the parents because they hold the keys to her future. And she fears herself most of all, the part of her that still hopes for gentleness in a house built on quiet tension. When you leave her room, the candle's faint glow lingers behind you, flickering in the draught like a heartbeat she has learned to hide. The servant's stairwell hides behind a narrow door paneling that blends almost seamlessly with the wall. You push it open, and the hinges give a soft, weary groan, as though they have carried too many years of hurried footsteps and hushed movements. This is the stairwell no guest is meant to find steep, dim, and stripped of ornament. While the main staircase performs elegance for visitors, this one bears the weight of the unseen work that keeps the household alive. The air feels cooler here, touched by draughts that slip through cracks in the old plaster. The gas sconce flickers faintly, barely strong enough to chase away the shadows gathering along the steps. Each stair dips slightly at the center, worn into a hollow by countless feet, the maids carrying linens, the scullery boy hauling coal buckets, the governess retreating quietly after a bruising moment in the schoolroom. Their footsteps, quick and cautious, have carved a history into the wood. You descend, slowly, listening. The stairwell holds a faint symphony of its own. The whisper of skirts brushing the walls, the muffled clink of dishes from the kitchen below, the rustle of laundry pressed against aprons. Servants learned this staircase as though it were a second spine every turn, every creak, every place where silence was required most. The rhythms of the household travelled through this narrow space long before they reached the parlour floors. Halfway down, you pause beside a small alcove where a maid once stored a sewing basket. A few broken needles remain scattered inside tiny splinters of metal that speak of worn fabrics, torn sleeves, and the hurried repairs she made before any family member could notice their clothes had begun to fray. Victorian families expected perfection from their servants, and the stairwell carried the burden of that expectation. From the alcove, you hear faint echoes rising from below, not voices, but fragments of sound. A kettle hissing, footsteps shuffling across tile. A quiet cough. The walls here are thin, absorbing decades of whispered conversations. Servants confiding fears, complaining in coded phrases, planning brief, stolen moments of rest. They could never speak openly upstairs, but here, in the dim vertical spine of the house, they were almost allowed to be human. You descend further. The railing is smooth beneath your palm, polished by desperate grips on early mornings when exhaustion made their hands tremble. The banister dips slightly near the bottom, worn down by those who leaned against it during rare pauses, a stolen breath, a moment to gather strength before answering another bell. At the foot of the stairs lies a narrow landing where the scullery boy used to sit when his legs gave out. His small boot prints still faintly stain the floorboards. A chipped enamel cup rests on the corner shelf once filled with weak tea, the only luxury he could claim without reprimand. From this landing, a short hallway leads to the kitchen, bright, clattering, alive with movement, and another door leads back to the main corridor, the boundary between service and gentility. Servants cross that threshold dozens of times a day, switching roles mid-step, invisible downstairs, silent upstairs, never themselves in either place. Even now, the stairwell feels alive with their presence. The air hums with the memory of urgency, the kind that kept the house functioning while its family remained unaware. Every inch of this narrow shaft carries the imprint of their labor, their fear, their endurance. You turn back toward the stairs, placing your foot on the first step. The wood sighs beneath you, as though welcoming another's weight, one more witness to the lives lived quietly in the seams of the household. The servant stairwell remains what it has always been, a hidden artery pulsing beneath polished floors, a place where truths traveled freely, and where the house whispered its secrets only to those who carried them. The writing desk in the small sitting room looks harmless enough, a practical piece of furniture where correspondence is kept neatly tied with ribbon, where ink pots sit aligned, where envelopes are stacked with quiet discipline. But the stillness surrounding it feels deceptive. Victorian homes lived and died by their letters. They preserved reputations, disguised disasters, orchestrated marriages, and threaded expectations between households. And in this house, the letters did something more. They revealed truths never meant for the wrong eyes. You approach the desk slowly. The air here is faintly scented with sealing wax and dust, a scent that has seeped into the grain of the wood after years of careful writing, anxious folding, and the sharp imprint of a signet ring pressed to hot wax. The surface is polished, but beneath the sheen are subtle scratches made by restless hands, fingers tapping, pens hesitating, envelopes gripped too tightly. A stack of letters tied with pale, blue ribbon sits perfectly at the center. Blue, the mother's preferred color. You imagine her sitting here after dark, candlelight trembling over the page, as she wrote in small, careful script. Letters to her sister. Letters to a friend who lived far enough away that truth felt safer on ink. Some of the envelopes bear faint tear marks along the edges, opened too quickly, perhaps in desperation, perhaps in dread. Beside the stack lies another bundle, this one tied in stark crimson. These must belong to the father. The ribbon is crisp, the knots precise, the envelopes arranged with an almost military severity. If you lift the top one, you would find a hand as rigid as his posture, terse sentences, clipped courtesies, commands disguised as suggestions. Correspondence, not of affection, but of arrangement. But it is the loose letter, the one tucked beneath the blotter, partly exposed as though hidden in haste, that draws your eye. The handwriting is different, smaller, rushed, a child's hand trying to mimic adult script. When you lift it gently, the paper trembles not from your fingers, but from the weight of what it contains. Please don't be angry. I didn't mean to hear. But the walls are thin. Mama cried again last night. I think something is wrong with my brother. He doesn't eat at supper anymore. Please come. Please. No signature. No date. Only the quiet plea of a daughter who dared to write what she could not say aloud. This letter was never sent. You imagine the moment she wrote it, sitting at the desk with her ear still ringing from the muffled argument behind the locked parlor door, her hand shaking as she pressed the nib into ink, writing quickly before footsteps approached, her breath catching when she heard the father's voice on the landing, folding the letter with trembling hands, tucking it under the blotter, intending to send it in the morning, and then forgetting or losing courage or having the letter discovered by someone who closed it quietly and left it where it lay. You return it gently to its hiding place. A faint rustle draws your attention to one of the blue ribbon bundles. The top envelope bears a faint smear of tears along the seal. The mother must have received news unwelcome, or frightening, or merely a reminder of what she longed for and could not have. She must have opened it in secrecy, here where no one was allowed to see her falter. Victorian families prized restraint, but letters betrayed what their voices could not. Fear, loneliness, regret, affection too fragile to speak. The desk contains all of it, every truth too sharp for daylight, every confession too risky for conversation, every plea for help that never reached its destination. You step back, letting the soft light fall again across the paper and ribbon. The room grows still, as though relieved to have its secrets noticed. If only for a moment, the letters rest quietly now, waiting for someone who will never read them, and someone who never meant to. The doctor arrives just after dawn, the hour when the house is still fragile from the night before. His presence moves through the entry hall like a cold draft, precise footsteps, the faint scent of carbolic soap, the rustle of a medical bag heavy with instruments that inspire confidence but rarely deliver comfort. Victorian medicine was as much performance as knowledge, and in this house, the doctor's visits play out like a ritual everyone fears but no one challenges. You hear him before you see him, the click of the front door latch, the soft clearing of his throat as he steps onto the tiled floor. A servant leads him toward the sitting room, her eyes lowered, careful not to betray concern. Servants know better than to reveal emotion in front of doctors. Emotion invites questions, and questions were something this family did not want. When he enters the sitting room, the air tightens. The mother stands beside the window, hands folded, shoulders stiff beneath her shawl. She offers him a faint greeting, polite but thin, before retreating behind the fainting couch, where she can brace herself unseen. The father remains standing, his posture straight, his tone clipped. He wants answers, but not truth. He wants reassurance, but not responsibility. The doctor opens his black leather bag. Inside lies an array of gleaming tools, a stethoscope made of polished wood, a thermometer the size of a penknife, glass bottles filled with bitter liquids and powdered promises. He handles each object with deliberate calm, as though certainty can be conjured from the sound of a cork popping free. He never asks the questions he should. He does not ask why the child flinches when a floorboard creaks. He does not ask why the mother's eyes look swollen from sleepless nights. He does not ask why the son sits with his arms held too closely to his sides, as though protecting something fragile. He does not ask why the daughter avoids everyone's gaze, staring instead at her folded hands. Instead, he asks questions that do not matter, questions designed to soothe rather than uncover. How long has the fever lasted? Did the child sleep? Has she eaten? Has he been restless? Questions with answers the family can disguise. He listens to the daughter's breathing through the wooden stethoscope, his expression unreadable. Her breath trembles slightly, not from illness, but from fear of answering incorrectly. He nods, writes a note, declares it a minor affliction, something nerves or the weather might explain. Victorian doctors loved to blame the weather. It required no further inquiry. The son sits next. The doctor checks his pulse, steady but too quiet, and nods again. Another tonic, another vague explanation, another dismissal. The father relaxes subtly, relieved not to confront anything deeper. No one notices the son's faint swallow of disappointment. He had hoped someone might ask him how long he had felt unwell. Someone who would listen. But the doctor does not ask. He turns last to the mother, whose trembling hands betray more truth than her soft voice ever will. She insists she is fine. She insists she is only tired. The doctor accepts her words without hesitation, though the shadows beneath her eyes speak of something far heavier than fatigue. He prescribes rest and a diluted laudanum tincture, the Victorian cure for everything and nothing, and she nods gratefully, though she knows it will numb her more than it heals her. When he finishes, he snaps the brass clasp on his bag shut. The sound echoes sharply, like a verdict. He offers polite reassurances as he gathers his things, his coat brushing faintly against the doorframe. The father slips coins discreetly into his hand, not payment, but gratitude for not asking dangerous questions. The doctor leaves the way he came, quietly, efficiently, unquestioningly. The house exhales, but the air does not clear. It thickens instead, heavy, with everything left unspoken. In Victorian homes, silence was often mistaken for health, and doctors helped preserve that illusion, one unasked question at a time. The announcement came quietly, but its echo rattled through the house like a storm trapped beneath the roof. Victorian families prided themselves on propriety, on measured reactions, on discipline administered with precise timing. But the child's sudden departure, an aunt in the country, a boarding school, an uncle's estate, left the household suspended between order and unease. You can still feel it in the hallways, the vacuum where laughter, whispers, and footsteps once existed. You enter the child's bedroom. It is smaller than the other children's rooms, tucked away at the end of the upper hallway, a space once vibrant with miniature chairs, a writing desk cluttered with small scraps of paper, and a wooden chest brimming with toys. Now it feels abandoned. The bedspread is smooth but untouched, the curtains drawn just enough to suggest someone might return, though everyone knows that the child will not. A faint dusting of sunlight falls across the floorboards, highlighting scuff marks where tiny feet ran in circles, chasing imaginary shadows. You can almost hear the pitter-patter, the soft creak of boards pressed down with excitement, the whispers shared with siblings who were suddenly left behind. Every mark on the floor is a memory of presence, of a body that moved too quickly for caution, of a hand that touched too many things too eagerly. The desk remains cluttered with school books, a few open at half-finished exercises, pencil stubs lying on the blotter like exhausted soldiers abandoned mid-battle. The governess must have packed the essentials in a small trunk late last night, folding each garment with care, hiding letters she suspected the child would not send, and sealing the bundle of possessions that represented a childhood temporarily uprooted. Outside the room, the house is quieter than usual. Servants move with muted steps, knowing to avoid accidental noise. The mother retreats to her fainting room briefly, clutching a handkerchief, steeling herself against the guilt that lingers in the air. The father walks along the corridor, hands behind his back, speaking softly only when necessary, as though volume might disrupt the fragile balance he has forced upon the household. Even the walls seem to hold their breath, waiting for the echo of departure to fade before exhaling. You lift a small, worn toy from the chest, a wooden horse with chipped paint. It is light in your hand, yet heavy with absence. The child must have left it behind in haste, too impatient to carry everything. This toy, once a companion to imaginary adventures and secret triumphs, now rests alone, a silent witness to the sudden fracture of the family. In the nursery, faint pencil marks trace the edge of the wallpaper, where the child might have once measured height or counted days, each line a testament to growth now interrupted. The room has been scrubbed, dusted, and aired, yet it carries the subtle odor of anxiety, of small hands, lingering over furniture before the last footsteps faded. You step back into the hallway. The door closes quietly behind you, but the memory of the child lingers. The house itself seems to lean slightly toward the empty room, pressing against the absence, holding it in place. Victorian propriety demanded calm, but the invisible tension remains, a family balanced between what is expected and what is lost. The child has been sent away suddenly, but the house remembers everything: the whispered apologies, the unspoken tears, the hurried packing, the final glance cast over shoulder. And though the family resumes their routines, nothing here will ever be the same. The echoes of a childhood uprooted drift along the upper hallways, soft but insistent, carried forever by the floorboards and the walls. The son's room is at the end of the west wing, where the walls narrow and the ceiling slopes just enough to feel confining. Sunlight creeps in through high windows, slicing across the floorboards in pale, hesitant beams. Victorian homes prided themselves on order, on control, on molding children into heirs who would carry the family name with precision. But this boy, this son, resists. Every step, every gesture, every glance holds the quiet rebellion of one who refuses to bend completely. The room is sparsely decorated. A tall, rigid wardrobe dominates one corner, its doors shut tightly, polished to a dull sheen. A writing desk faces the window, strewn with books, maps, and scattered sheets of paper. Each page bears sketches and notes, a mind restless and unwilling to conform. Arithmetic and Latin texts lie stacked to one side, but their corners are bent, edges frayed, evidence of impatience, of a boy who learns only what he wishes to absorb. You notice the bed, neatly made, as though someone else had done it, yet a deep indentation at the center betrays restless sleep. He rises early, pacing the floorboards in silence, practicing measured steps as if testing the house's patience. The floor creaks softly under his weight, a rhythm the walls have learned over years, up and down, back and forth, a boy negotiating his freedom within confinement. Victorian heirs were expected to emulate authority and submission simultaneously, to internalize their father's temperament while projecting control. This boy understands the expectations, but meets them with subtle resistance. A raised eyebrow, a pause before obeying, a hand lingering on the window latch, all small, deliberate acts that mark him as unwilling to be fully disciplined. The house senses it. The floorboards respond differently beneath him, flexing with tension rather than silent compliance. Near the window, a small chest contains personal items he does not wish to display. A carved whistle, a half-finished model ship, a few small marbles tucked carefully in a velvet pouch. These objects are more than playthings. They are declarations of independence, artifacts of a mind seeking expression beyond the family's rigid expectations. A sketchbook lies open on the desk, depicting scenes of the world beyond the estate streets of distant cities, ships on the horizon, figures in motion. Each stroke is careful, yet defiant, as though asserting a vision that refuses to be contained within walls or rules. The boy studies the lines often, lingering, tracing them with fingers that tremble slightly under the weight of expectation. The father's study is nearby. Every sound from that room, the turning of pages, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the clearing of a throat, is monitored instinctively. The boy does not flinch, but he moves deliberately, aware that each action is observed. He navigates the corridors like a shadow, balancing duty with the small autonomy he can claim. Even the servants notice his defiance, though they cannot speak of it. A slight tilt of the head, a muted sigh, a hand brushing too quickly over a polished surface. Each small motion signals that the heir is learning to exist in his own rhythm, one that does not fully bend to the household structure. As the morning light shifts across the sloped ceiling, the boy stands at the window, gazing outward. The wind brushes through the slightly open pane, carrying the faint scent of distant streets. For a moment, he is not heir, not subject, not observed. He is simply a boy, breathing, moving, defying quietly, shaping himself beyond the house's expectations. The floorboards remember, the walls remember, and the house, patient but aware, knows that some heirs cannot be fully molded, no matter how much the past demands compliance. The walls of the upper gallery are lined with portraits, their gilt frames glinting faintly in the soft morning light. Each face is arranged with meticulous care: stern fathers, composed mothers, solemn children posed to perfection. Victorian homes valued these images as markers of stability, evidence that order reigned. But here, the portraits do more than record likenesses. They watch, always, and sometimes they remember too much. You step slowly along the hallway, the wooden floor beneath you groans lightly, betraying your presence. In the stillness, the eyes of the painted figures seem to shift, as though following each step. The father's gaze, painted with authoritative precision, meets yours briefly, and a chill passes across your skin. The mother's serene expression hints at secrets the brush could not entirely disguise. Even the children, frozen in their fine attire, hold a tension that seems alive, as though the pressure of their upbringing had seeped into the canvas itself. Victorian families relied on appearances, but these portraits suggest that appearances can be treacherous. Behind every painted smile lies the weight of expectation, discipline, and unspoken disappointment. You imagine the hours it took to sit for these portraits, the children instructed to hold still, the mother reminded to smooth her hair and relax her hands, the father correcting posture with a subtle, invisible authority. All the while, the painter captured not only their likenesses, but the atmosphere of the household, the tension beneath the surface. A faint draught drifts from a nearby window, rustling the edges of the frames. The glass, though clean, reflects the hallway in distorted fragments. You catch glimpses of yourself and of the portraits together, an uneasy convergence of observer and observed. There is something unsettling in the way the painted eyes seem to acknowledge your presence, as if aware that new intrusions will pass through the corridor, carrying fresh truths the house does not wish to admit. You pause before a portrait of the daughter, painted during her early years. Her expression is carefully neutral, lips closed in a polite line, but her eyes, captured in subtle shadow, reveal impatience, curiosity, and something unreadable. Perhaps it is the same resolve that kept her from bending fully to the family's rules, the quiet defiance that manifests in late-night sketches and whispered secrets. The son's portrait nearby holds a similar tension, posture rigid, face composed, but hands clenched ever so slightly in the painting, a small rebellion frozen in time. Every frame seems to hum with memory. The artist may have thought only to capture appearances, But the house has preserved much more: the small arguments that passed unnoticed, the hushed sobs, the laughter stifled by expectation, the fear and longing that seeped into every corner. Portraits in Victorian homes were meant to assert control, yet here they betray it. They remember, even when the family hopes they forget. You step back, letting the hallway breathe again. The light shifts slowly, and the eyes of the portrait seem to linger a moment longer, as though acknowledging your departure. The house has kept its secrets for generations, but the paintings hold a patience that surpasses human memory. In this gallery, the family is always observed, always measured, always weighed, and the portraits, patient witnesses, continue to watch too closely, storing every moment that was never allowed to speak. The gas lamp at the end of the hall wavers, a thin ribbon of light trembling against the wallpaper. Victorian homes relied on these lamps not just for illumination, but for order, for rhythm, for signaling the passage of time in a household ruled by ritual. Tonight, the flicker carries a warning, subtle but insistent, as though the house itself were inhaling sharply in anticipation. You step into the hallway, and the shadows deepen. They pool along the edges of the carpet, curl beneath the banister, and press into the corners where light cannot reach. Every footstep disturbs them slightly, and yet the house feels heavier, charged with the memories the lamp has witnessed. The flicker reveals faint traces on the walls, handprints, smudges, the slight discoloration where someone pressed too hard in a moment of panic or urgency. The children's rooms are silent, but not empty. You sense the daughter's faint movements beneath the quilt, a small stir of restless dreaming. The son's breathing comes slow and even, though the creak of the floorboards above suggests he too is awake, pacing, wrestling with expectations pressed too tightly against his chest. The lamp dances across the corridors, illuminating a grandfather clock and casting its pendulum in long, shifting shadows, each swing a measured heartbeat in the house's slow, tense pulse. Downstairs, the kitchen hums faintly, the remnants of fires long banked, a pot left simmering, a servant who moved too quickly in the dim light and froze when the gas lamp flickered. In Victorian households, servants adapted to these changes instantly. A lamp that falters can reveal what was meant to remain hidden: a misplaced dish, a secret note, a suppressed sigh. You move closer to the lamp. Its flame flutters, sputters, then steadies for a moment, casting light unevenly across the walls. In its glow, you see the mother's faint silhouette as she passed through the hall earlier. She walks with deliberate slowness, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Even her shadow seems burdened, bowing slightly under the weight of unspoken worry. She knows the lamp is a witness, just as the house itself has been, to her silent prayers, to the children's whispered fears, to the father's quiet judgment that settles like dust on every surface. The flicker shifts again, and for a brief moment, the shadows seem almost alive. You imagine the house, remembering every flicker it has seen over the years. Nights when a child's fevered brow pressed against a cool window pane, when the mother's tears fell in private, when arguments were held in whispers and measured gestures. The gas lamp does not simply illuminate. It observes, it remembers, it judges. A faint thump echoes from the staircase, a foot brushing the wall too closely. A book dropped in silence, the nervous shift of a hand on the banister. The lamp trembles in response, casting jagged shadows along the corridor. In Victorian homes, even minor disturbances could ripple outward, magnifying the weight of expectation, discipline, and fear. You step back from the lamp, letting the hallway absorb your presence. The flame steadies once more, but its subtle quiver lingers in the corner of your vision. The house exhales slowly, carrying with it the memory of the flicker, a night when silence was too tense, shadows stretched too far, and the family's hidden truths pressed close to the surface. Tonight, the gas lamp will flicker again, and the house will remember everything it saw. The father's study is dim, lit only by the early morning light spilling through a tall window and the soft glow of a single gas lamp. Victorian homes prized order, but here, in the quiet sanctum of the father's domain, that order is absolute. The furniture is arranged with careful precision. The desk sits center, papers aligned, ink pots polished, books stacked by height. Every object has a purpose. Every movement of a hand carries weight. You step into the room, and the floorboards creak beneath you. A minor transgression that seems amplified by the stillness. He sits behind the desk, hands clasped over one another, posture rigid. His eyes, dark and assessing, do not need to move to command. They settle on everything at once: the ink blot on a ledger, the slight tilt of a chair, the dust gathered where a hand should have polished. Victorian fathers ruled through presence as much as through word, and here that presence is absolute, a force that bends the air around him. The child stands at attention across the room. Every inch of posture has been corrected, every expression rehearsed to meet invisible expectations. The daughter watches from the doorway, her small hands folded carefully, eyes flicking between father and brother. The mother hovers near the window, calm but tense, aware that any sound could draw scrutiny. In this house, even silence is measured. The father lifts a hand slowly, a gesture precise, deliberate. It is enough to alter the mood of the room. The children flinch subtly. The daughter's lips press tighter. The son shifts his weight imperceptibly. No words are necessary. His judgment saturates the space. Victorian discipline often relied on the spoken reprimand, but here the unspoken rules carry heavier weight. Every glance, every tilt of the head, every minute inflection conveys authority and expectation. He opens a ledger, fingers tracing numbers without speaking. The room breathes around him, attuned to every micro-movement. Even the lamp flickers in response, shadows stretching and contracting as if the house itself acknowledges his sway. In this home, decisions are often silent. Obedience is enforced through the atmosphere, compliance assumed before a single command is uttered. A small creak draws his eyes momentarily to the floor, a servant's misstep perhaps, or a child adjusting nervously. His gaze returns to the ledger, unyielding, but the room remains taut, all aware of scrutiny. Victorian homes prided themselves on decorum, but in households like this one, decorum was a form of surveillance, a persistent evaluation of worth and behavior. The father's attention shifts briefly to a letter on the desk, unfolded but unfinished. He reads its contents with the same measured silence he applies to the household, evaluating, weighing, determining. His judgment is impartial yet inevitable. Decisions are communicated without voice, lessons delivered in posture, gaze, and the rigid logic of expectation. When he Brusset finally rises, every movement is deliberate, commanding yet controlled. The children adjust, the mother straightens, and even the house seems to inhale and relax slightly in recognition. Victorian authority was rarely challenged, and in this house it is omnipresent, tangible, suffocating, and enduring. He leaves the room, footsteps echoing down the corridor, and the silence remains, thick with unspoken verdicts. The family knows they have been observed, measured, and deemed, and the weight of that quiet judgment lingers, threading through the floors, the walls, and the very air they breathe. The nursery door creaks softly as you step inside, a thin veil of dust swirling in the pale light that filters through lace curtains. Victorian children were trained to obey, to be seen but not heard. Yet here, in this small room tucked at the far end of the hall, the children have learned something else. The house whispers, and it teaches. Every floorboard groan, every shifting shadow, every faint draft through the window carries lessons older than their years. Toys are scattered across the floor, arranged in patterns that only the children understand. A wooden train sits paused mid-track, a miniature horse frozen mid-gallop. Each object bears traces of tiny fingers, the echoes of secrets pressed into the grains of wood and carved edges. These toys are not mere playthings. They are instruments in a clandestine education, one the parents never intended. The daughter kneels beside the low writing desk, a slate open before her. She scratches faint letters into the surface, a whispered code shared with no one, yet understood by all who inhabit the room. Her eyes flick toward the door whenever a footstep approaches, and then she bends back to her work, determined that no adult witness will intervene. Victorian decorum trains children in obedience, but the house itself teaches discretion, resilience, and observation. Across the rug, the son crouches with a small notebook, mapping the rooms and corridors of the house in careful diagrams. Each hallway, each staircase, each hidden alcove is noted in precise lines and measurements. He records patterns of sound, shadow, and footsteps, the subtle rhythms that dictate the family's movements. By the time he completes the drawing, he has absorbed not just the physical layout, but the invisible logic of authority and fear that governs the household. A faint rustle signals the mother's passage in the corridor outside. The children freeze instinctively, neither moving nor breathing audibly. They have learned to predict her moods by the tilt of her head, the soft clatter of her slippers, the subtle scent of lavender soap and damp shawl. The father's presence is different, heavier, more commanding. Footfalls in the hall beneath his study windows signal a shift in tension, a tightening of posture, and a suppression of sound. The children watch, learn, and internalize these lessons without instruction, absorbing what adults can never articulate. Even the servants contribute, often unwittingly. A quiet remark here, a misstep there, a hastily dropped tray. Every detail becomes part of the children's hidden education. They understand where to hide, what to whisper, how to navigate expectation. Victorian houses valued appearance above truth, yet these walls have passed down knowledge in silence. By the time the morning light stretches across the room, the children have catalogued events, measured the angles of shadows, and memorized the timing of movement. They understand discipline without ever being reprimanded directly. They know when to speak and when to retreat. They know the weight of secrets. As you leave the nursery, the floorboards sigh gently, the air still thick with quiet lessons. The children's education is not in their books or lessons. It is in the absorption of the house itself, in the subtle orchestration of authority, fear, and observation. The nursery is a school without a teacher, and the children are scholars of the unspoken, carrying knowledge they will never articulate aloud, yet will never forget. The corridor stretches long and narrow, the wallpaper fading into muted patterns where the light barely reaches. Victorian houses like this one relied on the subtle sounds of movement to govern the household. The soft creak of floorboards, the shuffle of slippers, the whispered commands of a governess guiding her charges. Tonight, the house feels different. The footsteps have stopped. You move slowly along the hall, noticing how the quiet has grown thick, almost tangible. Every shadow seems to gather in the corners, holding its breath. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and wax polish, but there is another scent layered beneath it: tension, unease, and the unspoken knowledge of those who have learned too many secrets. The house listens. The children's rooms are dark, the curtains drawn tightly. The daughter's bed is perfectly made, the quilt tucked so neatly it almost seems to smooth out the edges of her anxiety. The son's small desk is abandoned, its papers and sketches lying as he left them, frozen in a moment of defiance or distraction. The nursery is still, but the weight of all the whispers, all the suppressed laughter and hidden tears, presses heavily in the air. You pause by the father's study door. No sound escapes from within, not even the faint rustle of paper. His authority is always present, and yet tonight, even he has remained still, his footsteps absent from the hall. Victorian fathers imposed order, not only by action but by presence. But here, the absence is more telling. The silence speaks of anticipation, of withheld judgments, of tensions held taut in the muscles of the household. The mother's fainting room is quieter than usual, the curtains closed, the air thick with rosewater and lavender. She moves no longer between rooms, no longer pacing with anxious hands folded over her chest. It is as though the house has stilled in recognition of the night itself, a pause in the rhythm it normally enforces. Even the servants tread, lightly, holding their breath, aware that tonight demands vigilance beyond ordinary duty. A shadow stretches across the floorboards. Perhaps it is only yours, or perhaps the house is aware, shifting subtly under its own weight. The portraits in the hallway seem to watch more intently, their painted eyes sharper, as if noting the absence of motion with some grim approval. Victorian homes were repositories of appearances and memories alike, and in this corridor, the stillness has become a statement. The hearth in the main hall casts only a pale flicker of light, enough to outline shapes, not enough to illuminate truth. You imagine every whisper that would have passed along this hall, secrets, fears, admonishments, confessions, and plans. All of them are now suspended, hanging in the air like dust motes caught in candlelight. When you reach the staircase, the absence of sound is nearly oppressive. No footfalls, no scuttling, no low murmurs. The house exhales slowly, the silence settling into its timbers. The night has stretched taut across every room, and the floorboards remember that pause, holding it like a secret for decades to come. Tonight, the footsteps have stopped, and the house waits, listening to its own quiet, remembering all that has passed through it and all that it has swallowed. The writing desk in the corner of the study holds its usual weight. Neat stacks of envelopes bound with faded ribbons, ink pots gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Victorian households relied on letters to maintain connection, to manage affairs, and to control appearances. But in this house, some letters never reached their intended recipients, and those left unanswered became records of tension, anxiety, and quiet rebellion. You step closer to the desk. A faint smell of sealing wax lingers, mixed with the subtle sweetness of rosewater that the mother favored. The surface of the wood is polished, but beneath it, faint scratches trace patterns where hands pressed too firmly in moments of frustration or fear. Each mark is a subtle memory, a trace of the emotions that were never permitted to surface openly. The unopened letters form neat bundles, some tied in pale blue ribbon, others in crimson. Each bundle carries its own significance. Requests for permission, confessions of errors, reminders of obligations. The father's stack is rigid, ordered, and precise, reflecting the authority and expectation he demands. The mother's letters are more delicate, folded with care, carrying undertones of private anxieties, coded language, and hidden pleas. The children's letters, small, hurried, sometimes illegible, hint at rebellion, longing, or quiet despair. A single envelope, slightly separated from the rest, draws your attention. Its paper is worn, edges frayed, the seal faintly cracked. Inside, the child's small, uneven handwriting reveals emotions carefully stifled. Worry for siblings, fear of misjudgment, questions that cannot be spoken aloud. Victorian etiquette dictated restraint, yet the ink captures honesty the house could not bear to acknowledge. Each letter is a silent witness to moments the walls themselves absorbed, whispered apologies, tiny frustrations, and fleeting joys hidden beneath layers of composure. You imagine the mother sitting here late, at night, quill in hand, pausing with each stroke. Her fingers tremble slightly, pressing hard against the paper, shaping sentences meant to be received but also controlled. She writes to friends far away, to relatives she trusts, to correspondents who will never interfere. Each word is carefully measured, a mix of truth and concealment. Some letters were destroyed after reading, others filed meticulously, awaiting a time when they might matter again. The father rarely handles his correspondence in private. He reviews orders, instructions, and reminders with deliberate calm. His letters rarely ask for explanation, rarely express concern, but carry authority in each line. Even the choice of words, the spacing of sentences, the manner of closure, all communicate judgment. Any deviation from expectation is noted silently, preserved in his memory, and reflected in the rigid order of the household. Even the servants, observers of every daily movement, know the power letters carry. They pass messages carefully, sometimes intercepting or delaying, aware that the wrong timing could disrupt the fragile balance of obedience and discipline. Victorian households functioned on observation, understanding, and the subtle conveyance of authority, and letters were both tools and weapons in that silent war. You step back from the desk. The envelopes remain, untouched yet potent, repositories of emotion and expectation. The house exhales softly around them, the air thick with all that is left unsaid. Every letter, whether opened or ignored, holds a memory of vigilance, restraint, and quiet consequence. The unanswered letters wait, and the house remembers everything they were meant to conceal. The servant corridor is unnervingly still, stripped of its usual rhythm. Footsteps that should have echoed along the narrow hallway are absent. Victorian households depended on constant movement, the murmur of trays, the whisper of linens, the careful scuff of slippers. Tonight, that rhythm is broken. A servant has vanished overnight, and the house holds its breath. You step carefully down the dim passage, the carpet muffling each footfall. The walls press inward, and the air smells faintly of soot and wax, mingled with something metallic, almost like old coins. The absence is tangible. This servant, whose presence had been quiet but essential, carried the household's secrets with her, observed everything, moved unseen, and now she is gone. Every creak of the floorboard seems louder in her absence. The small chamber where she slept is tidy yet uninhabited. The straw mattress bears only faint impressions of last night's rest, the blanket folded with habitual care. On the bedside table, a tin cup sits overturned, untouched, and a comb lies abandoned. No note explains her disappearance. Victorian etiquette often demanded explanation, but here, silence answers questions more effectively than words could. You examine the hallway outside the room. Footsteps could have gone in any direction, but the echoes tell no story. The servants who remain move with hesitation, glances cast nervously toward closed doors. Each knows that secrets pass through this corridor daily, and now, one thread has been cut. The missing servant had seen too much. The daughter's late-night sketches, the son's clandestine maps, the mother's private fainting, and the father's silent judgments. In a house like this, knowledge was both power and liability. Downstairs, in the kitchen, the absence is equally palpable. A basin of water left for washing sits cold. A tray of utensils remains untouched. The other servants whisper quietly, avoiding the gaze of the cook who stands rigid, hands pressed against the countertop. The household has a hierarchy, and one missing link disrupts the delicate balance of oversight and obedience. Victorian homes relied on these silent gears, and the sudden removal of even a single cog leaves the whole mechanism tense, waiting for adjustment. You move back to the stairwell, tracing the worn wood where she must have descended in the dark hours before dawn. Every step taken over years has been absorbed into the timber, a record of urgency, discretion, and quiet labor. Now, the floorboards bear only a new emptiness, a pause that stretches longer than a single night. The house exhales through the corridors. The walls remember, pressing tightly around the absence, storing the memory of every tray carried, every whispered observation, every footfall that has now ceased. Victorian households were built for appearances, for order, and for control. But when one servant disappears, the illusion falters. The family will notice her absence, but they will not speak of it aloud. Propriety forbids acknowledgement, yet the truth vibrates through every beam, every shadow, every creak. The servant has vanished overnight, and the house keeps her secrets better than anyone else ever could. The house feels smaller in winter, the corridors tighter, the ceilings lower, and the air heavy with frost that creeps between the seams of the old stonework. The windows are shuttered, thick curtains drawn to keep out the cold, and yet the chill presses inside like an unwelcome memory. Victorian families prided themselves on order and warmth, but this house achieves neither entirely. Its cold is deliberate, disciplined, a reminder that life is constrained as surely as the frost biting the panes. You walk slowly through the hall, your steps swallowed by the thick carpet. Each footfall creaks softly against the boards, a faint echo in the silent house. The winter light is pale, filtered through the heavy curtains, slicing across walls lined with portraits that seem to stare harder than usual. In the cold, those painted faces appear sharper, harsher, as though the frost itself has accentuated the shadows beneath brows and around eyes. Victorian decorum demands composure, but here, Victorian decorum demands composure. Chill exposes every taut line of restraint. The children's rooms are shuttered as well. The daughter's bed lies beneath heavy drapes, quilt tucked tight around her, breathing quiet and shallow. You can almost see the contours of her worry. The fear of being too loud, the knowledge that any misstep could disrupt the careful balance the adults maintain. The son's desk is scattered with paper, sketches, and small wooden toys, left mid-use, untouched for hours. Frost from the windows has left tiny beads of condensation on the sill, droplets that seem to track the hours he spent awake, plotting and observing, quietly defying the expectations pressed upon him. In the kitchen, the servants move carefully. The basin for washing clothes sits half-filled, its contents cold from the draught. Pans clink faintly as they are shifted with quiet precision, the workers aware that any careless noise will carry down the hall, past the sleeping family. In Victorian households, winter amplifies control. The lack of warmth keeps bodies alert, silent, obedient. The house itself enforces discipline through the bite of cold that settles into bone and breath. You pause at the staircase leading to the upper floors. The banister is icy to the touch, the polished wood retaining the chill of the night. Each step has been worn smooth from decades of use, yet in the winter they resist movement, creaking unevenly, responding to hesitation with low groans. The children have learned to navigate these stairs carefully, timing their passage to avoid notice, listening for the muffled sound of the parents' presence upstairs. Every movement is calculated, disciplined, and restrained by the frozen rhythm of the house itself. The mother's fainting room is closed tight, its curtains drawn, hiding the warmth of the fire within. Even she cannot entirely escape the cold. She sits, hands pressed to her chest, waiting for the household to stabilize, for the temperature of authority to outweigh the chill pressing at the edges of her composure. Victorian households masked fear and fatigue behind poise and ritual, but the winter leaves no such mask intact. The father's study, too, remains shuttered, lamp flickering faintly through the panes, casting shadows across walls that have grown sharper with the frost. Even in isolation, his presence is felt, controlling the air, influencing the rhythm of the household. Every room is affected. The children learn to move, speak, and breathe in accordance with his watchfulness, and the servants obey instinctively. Tonight, the house is quiet, cold, and unyielding. The windows remain locked, and the frost presses inward. The family endures, constrained by walls, by expectation, and by winter's slow, relentless weight. The son's chamber, perched at the far end of the west wing, is quieter than the rest of the house, but not empty. Victorian homes were structured to impose order on every inch of space, and the heir's room was no exception, meant to train him for authority, to shape him into a future patriarch. Yet within these walls, subtle resistance thrives. You step inside and notice the desk near the window, cluttered with sketches and maps. The pages are filled with diagrams that trace the corridors, the staircases, the hidden alcoves of the house, a meticulous record of movement, of surveillance, of opportunity. The boy traces invisible patterns with his fingers along the wood, imagining routes and moments where the household's rigid order might be bent without consequence. Victorian children were taught obedience, But this one quietly tests boundaries, learning when to move, when to remain unseen, when to speak. The bed is unmade, blankets twisted, pillows pressed unevenly, evidence of restless nights spent awake, planning, observing, resisting. A faint draught slips beneath the window, carrying the scent of the winter streets outside, a reminder of a world beyond the house's control. The sun leans toward it, as if drawing strength from its possibility, imagining freedom in the cold air, beyond parental vigilance. On the dresser lies a small box of personal items, a carved whistle, a few worn marbles, a compass with a cracked face. These objects are innocuous, yet they mark a silent rebellion, private treasures and tools of exploration, asserting the child's small autonomy within a world designed to suppress it. Victorian society prized conformity, yet the boy's mind resists, calculating and quietly asserting itself. Footsteps echo faintly in the hall, and he freezes instinctively. The father's presence is a constant authority, felt even when absent, and every action in the house is measured against his expectations. The boy has learned to read these echoes, anticipating judgments before they arrive, crafting movements and gestures that appear compliant while preserving autonomy. Every step, every breath, is calculated in the silent negotiation of survival within the household hierarchy. The daughter's faint whisper drifts through the adjoining wall. She is unaware of the full extent of her brother's private strategies, yet their lives intersect in these hushed hours. Lessons in secrecy, observation, and discretion are absorbed through walls, floors, and the subtle rhythms of family life. The servants, too, remain complicit in this unspoken education, never speaking aloud what they observe, but subtly shaping behavior through guidance, timing, and careful oversight. The boy picks up a sketch, tracing his finger along the lines of a hidden staircase, imagining movement through shadows and around authority. Each diagram represents not defiance for its own sake, but mastery over a space designed to impose control. Victorian, children were molded, yet here, intelligence and foresight bend the rules silently, invisibly. By the window, he pauses, eyes on the pale morning light. He is the heir, but not wholly owned by the expectations pressed upon him. He endures, observes, calculates, and quietly resists. In this room, within these walls, rebellion is measured, deliberate, invisible, and the house, patient and watchful, records it all. The attic is narrow and steep, its floorboards sagging slightly in the middle from decades of quiet use. Victorian households often treated their attics as storage, a place for trunks, forgotten furniture, and boxes of linens. But in this house, the attic is more than that. It holds whispers, secrets, and confessions that were never meant to see the light of day. The low ceiling forces you to move slowly, deliberately, as if any sudden motion might awaken the memories sleeping in the rafters. Dust motes float in the slanting morning light, filtering through a single grimy window. They drift lazily, settling on trunks, wooden chests, and crates, each layered with the residue of years and the faint scent of cedar. These objects have absorbed the energy of the household, arguments stifled, instructions given in clipped tones, children reprimanded for whispers too loud or questions too bold. The attic preserves the echoes of those moments, folding them into the worn wood and faded upholstery like pressed flowers. You approach a trunk at the center of the room, its leather worn and scuffed, its brass clasps are tarnished, bearing fingerprints that must have belonged to hands both trembling and purposeful. Inside lie letters tied with faded ribbons, bundles of documents folded meticulously. Some are from the mother, written late at night in carefully measured script. Others belong to the father, the edges of the paper stiff from years of handling. And then there are the children's notes, hurried, uneven, frantic at times, revealing observations and fears they dared not voice openly. The attic walls themselves seem to lean inward, as if listening. Every whispered confession, Every hurried apology, every stolen moment of mischief has settled into the plaster and beams. Victorian families prized decorum above all else, and yet these walls have preserved the truths they tried to conceal. Footsteps in the hall below do not reach this height. Voices are muted by the text weight of ceilings and rafters, leaving the attic as a chamber of memory and secrecy. A small rocking chair sits near the window, its finish dulled by time. It creaks slightly when you brush past it, as if responding to your presence. Perhaps a governess once rocked in it during the night, hands pressed over her mouth, listening to the children whisper their truths. Perhaps the mother sat there, pressing her forehead to her palm, sighing at what she could not control. The house remembers these moments, the fear, the relief, the quiet determination to endure without witnessing. A bundle of the children's letters is tied with a thread so frayed it might break at any moment. You lift one carefully. Inside, in tiny scrawled handwriting, are observations about the family. The father's silent judgment, the mother's suppressed tears, the patterns of obedience enforced across the household. The attic has stored them all, untouched, hidden, waiting for a time when someone might see the weight of what has been endured. You step back toward the trapdoor. The attic exhales in faint drafts, the air thick with memory and stillness. Below, life continues as before, but up here, in this room of whispered confessions, the past sits in concentrated silence. The attic does not speak, it does not judge, it remembers. The servant corridor stretches like a hidden vein through the house, narrow, dimly lit, and carrying the echoes of countless footsteps. Victorian servants moved with discretion, trained to exist without being noticed, to observe without acting. In this household, the corridor has seen more than anyone upstairs realizes. Each step, each whispered movement, each suppressed sigh has been recorded silently by the walls themselves. You step into the passage, feeling the slight give of the floorboards beneath your feet. The wood holds the memory of shoes scuffed in haste, of trays carried carefully, of whispers exchanged in fleeting moments when the family thought no one was listening. The servants' lives are a shadow mirror of the household above. They bear witness, they maintain order, and they carry knowledge that could upend everything if revealed. Along the walls, hooks hold aprons and caps, polished and arranged as meticulously as the family's silverware. Each garment has absorbed the shape of the body that wears it, the curve of a shoulder, the arch of a back, the tension in a hand. Victorian service demanded invisibility, yet it exacted attention to detail with relentless precision. The slightest lapse, a rumpled uniform, a misaligned tray, a soft gasp of frustration could be noted, remembered, and judged. A faint murmur drifts from the kitchen below. It is muffled, but clear enough to suggest conversation, or perhaps a reprimand shared quietly among the lower staff. Servants speak in codes. Tones, gestures, and timing convey messages that must never reach the family. A glance, a tilt of the head, a softly closed door, these are the language of the observed and the observers. Victorian households relied on such subtleties to maintain hierarchy, yet the servants' awareness gives them a quiet power all their own. Near the stairwell, a tray rests unused. Perhaps it was dropped last night, hurriedly replaced, the sound absorbed by the boards and the thick rug. Even accidents are woven into the memory of this corridor, catalogued in the subtle impressions left in wood and plaster. A servant pausing here, hand against the wall for balance, could feel the weight of the household pressing down. The children, the parents, the governess, the unspoken rules that govern movement and speech alike. You notice the faint scratch marks along the banister, small but numerous, evidence of nervous fingers gripping the wood in moments of fear or impatience. Each mark is a chronicle, a history of the small, invisible battles fought by those who maintain the household's surface perfection. Victorian propriety required patience and endurance. Yet here, in this corridor, endurance is layered with observation, subtle knowledge, and careful self-preservation. A draught slips beneath a door, stirring a curl of dust. The corridor seems to breathe with it, exhaling decades of suppressed truths. The servants' eyes, even when unseen, have measured every gesture, every word, every hesitation of the family above. They know the daughter's hidden drawings, the son's late-night sketches, the mother's secret tears, the father's quiet judgment. You step back, letting the corridor regain its stillness. The walls, the floor, the shadows, they have recorded it all, silently, invisibly, and thoroughly. Victorian service demanded obedience, but it also cultivated awareness. Here, every footstep, every glance, every whisper is remembered. The servants observe, the house listens, and the corridor preserves their quiet witness. The drawing room is dim, curtains drawn tightly to keep the winter light at bay. Victorian homes were meant to impress visitors, to project composure, elegance, and decorum. Yet tonight the space feels tense, fragile. A guest has arrived, a curious one, too perceptive, too attentive to the subtleties the family carefully conceals. Every furniture edge, every portrait, every polished surface seems to lean in, listening for the questions that should not be asked. You step quietly across the rug, noting the faint indentation of slippers that preceded you. The guest's voice is soft, polite, but probing. Every inquiry seems harmless on the surface, yet it unsettles the carefully maintained equilibrium. Questions about schedules, children, or health feel innocuous. But in this house, even a simple, "How is the boy?" carries potential danger. Victorian etiquette demanded civility, but it also required control. Control that the family feels slipping through its fingers with each syllable. The mother sits poised on the fainting couch, hands folded over her lap, her expression perfect. Her eyes, however, betray unease. She listens to the guest, nodding and murmuring polite responses, while internally counting syllables, measuring inflection, adjusting posture. A twitch of the eyelid, a slight pause each is an unspoken signal, and the guest notices. The daughter sits nearby, hands folded, whispering questions to herself, trying to understand why someone would risk so much by probing too deeply. Across the room, the father stands near the mantelpiece. His posture is rigid, one hand resting lightly on a gilded frame, the other tucked behind his back. His eyes follow every movement of the guest, noting the inflection, the angle of the head, the rhythm of speech. Victorian fathers were masters of subtle authority. His silence conveys judgment more sharply than words ever could. The guest senses it, glances downward briefly, and adjusts their tone. But curiosity still pricks insistently. The servants, stationed invisibly in doorways and behind curtains, move only as necessary, their hands clasped, eyes attentive. They have seen the effects of too many questions before. A flushed face, a tightened jaw, whispered reprimands, subtle silences. They do not intervene, but they observe, storing every exchange in memory, aware that even their small presence can temper the household's tension. On the table lies a tray of tea, untouched. The delicate clink of porcelain as the guest lifts a cup is almost deafening in the hush. Each sip, each gesture, becomes a performance in itself. The family answers, avoiding substance, relying on careful phrasing, rehearsed politeness, and measured tones. The guest presses gently, steering conversation toward the unknown corners of family life. Illnesses hidden, arguments hushed, children's quirks observed but unmentioned. Each answer stretches the household taut, a rope pulled tighter with every polite inquiry. By the time the visit ends, the guest has left, the door closing softly behind them. The room exhales, curtains fall back into place, carpets flatten slightly, and the air seems to release the tension it held. Yet the impression lingers. The household has survived scrutiny, but barely, and the memory of questions too boldly asked will remain, echoing quietly through corridors and walls. The guest asked too many questions, and the house remembered every one. The marketplace sits a few streets from the house. but its presence reaches into every room, every corridor, every heart in the household. Victorian families relied on market days not only for provisions, but for maintaining social appearances, trade, barter, and the subtle observation of neighbors. Yet here, the market carries a weight beyond commerce. It is a stage where loss is displayed delicately, where grief is translated into coins and gestures, and where a widow's quiet endurance speaks louder than words ever could. You step through the doorway, and the air hits differently, a mixture of smoke from hearths, the damp tang of winter streets, and the faint, sharp scent of herbs, spices, and dried flowers. Stalls line the narrow streets, their wooden frames creaking slightly under the weight of produce, fabric, and pottery. Victorian market etiquette demanded efficiency and restraint, but in this neighborhood it also carried the rhythm of survival. Merchants watch, buyers calculate, and every exchange is measured not only in value but in discretion. The widow's stall is small, tucked into a corner where the light is softer, the shadows deeper. Baskets of ribbons, second-hand linens, and preserved foods are arranged meticulously, yet the edges show wear, the corners frayed by handling. Each object tells a story. A plate once part of a fine service, a scarf gifted and now folded for sale, a jar of preserves made from fruit harvested and boiled in the quiet hours of morning. The widow's hands move deliberately, placing items with care, balancing concealment and display. Victorian widowhood demanded dignity, and she practices it with precision. A young child hovers nearby, her small fingers clutching a bundle of coins. She learns quickly from her mother how to fold hands politely, how to speak in measured tones, how to accept guidance without complaint. The child's eyes scan the crowd, noticing movements adults ignore, observing tension, the unspoken bargains, and the quiet cues of human behavior. This education is unintentional, learned in the subtle choreography of commerce and survival. Across the way, other market-goers move with the same careful attention. Victorian women carry baskets as extensions of themselves, balancing appearances, negotiating social expectations, and observing the delicate interactions of strangers. Men pass in measured steps, each nod and half-smile calculated to maintain decorum while asserting authority. The widow exists in this rhythm, managing grief, commerce, and reputation simultaneously, each task layered upon the other with practiced ease. You step closer to the stall, the widow's eyes flick upward, scanning faces, measuring expressions, noting hesitation. She speaks softly when addressing buyers, her tone precise, her words chosen for clarity and politeness. Every interaction is a careful balance, honesty tempered by survival, generosity measured to avoid vulnerability, sorrow hidden beneath composure. Coins change hands, packages are wrapped, and the market continues its quiet, deliberate rhythm. The widow stands, a pivot point between grief and endurance, commerce and necessity, observation and action. The streets carry her presence forward, and even the narrow alleyways seem to acknowledge her persistence, holding the echoes of every transaction, every glance, every measured word. The widow's market is more than trade. It is resilience in action. It is grief translated into motion. And it is a silent education for all who observe. The hearths burn low in the early morning, casting long shadows across the parlors and corridors. In Victorian homes, coal was more than fuel. It was a presence, an invisible weight pressing into every corner, a dark echo of labor and endurance. The house smells faintly of smoke and soot, even where polished floors and curtains attempt to mask it. The coal is under everything, seeping into the air, settling into carpets, and leaving its imprint on the lives it warms and the routines it governs. You step across the floorboards, feeling the subtle grit that remains despite careful sweeping. The servants move silently, trays in hand, their movements practiced and precise. They know every nuance of the coal's presence, how it influences the air, how it dictates the pace of work, and how it reminds the family of the effort required to maintain appearances. Even the children absorb it unconsciously. The son pacing with maps in hand, counting steps to avoid soiling shoes. The daughter adjusting her skirts to avoid coal dust from smudging her polished shoes. The mother sits near the fading warmth of the hearth, her hands folded tightly over her lap. The coal smoke brushes her skin faintly, the scent clinging to her hair. Yet she remains composed, her expression a mask of gentility. Victorian women were expected to endure discomfort without complaint, and here the coal reminds her of that expectation every moment. The persistent ash, the constant cleaning, the unrelenting heat that comes and goes with the whims of the fire. You glance at the father, standing near the fireplace, inspecting the logs and embers with meticulous care. Each piece of coal must be positioned to maximize warmth and minimize mess, a reflection of his insistence on control. In this household, the coal is as much a lesson as any lesson in manners or morality. Its presence reminds every occupant of the invisible labor that sustains the household, the hierarchy that governs behavior, and the endurance required to navigate it. In the servants' quarters, the coal heap is nearly a sacred object. Buckets of blackened lumps are lined neatly, each one weighed and measured for rationing. Servants track the supply carefully. Enough for warmth, enough to cook meals, enough to prevent scalded fingers and burned floors. Each handful carries the weight of responsibility and the subtle knowledge that any misstep, a spill, a misjudged ember will ripple upward, touching lives in the parlors and bedrooms above. You move to the staircase leading to the upper floors. Even here, traces of coal linger, a smudge on a step, a faint powder along the carpet's edge. The house breathes in these traces, holding them like a record of all the quiet labor that happens below, all the unseen endurance required to maintain order above. Victorian homes may have valued beauty and refinement, but the coal ensures that reality remains beneath the surface, persistent, unavoidable, and omnipresent. Every room carries the echo of the coal under everything, the heat that shapes movement, the dust that marks presence, the smell that lingers despite washing, the invisible burden that informs every gesture. The house itself seems aware of it, pressing the memory into the floorboards and walls. The coal under everything does not burn openly, it smolders quietly, and it remembers every step, every hand, every moment of endurance within the house. The son's desk sits beneath the tall window, light spilling in unevenly across scattered papers and ink pots. Victorian heirs were trained in discipline, obedience, and the careful management of appearances, yet this boy has cultivated a secret world known only to him. Each letter, carefully folded and hidden beneath ledgers or tucked into the corner of the drawer, is a whisper of defiance, a record of thoughts he cannot share aloud. You lift one envelope gently. The handwriting is small and precise, almost too controlled for a child. Inside, words are arranged with caution. Observations about the household, reflections on the quiet tyranny of expectation, musings on things seen and overheard that no one else can speak of. The letters reveal the meticulous mind of a boy who measures every step, every glance, every syllable spoken within the walls. Victorian education demanded submission, but these letters record a mind unwilling to fully yield. The desk bears evidence of repeated use, ink smudges, pencil marks erased and retraced, lines crossed out and rewritten. He has spent countless hours here, copying passages from books he is forbidden to read, noting patterns of behavior in the servants and family alike. Every observation is catalogued, every reaction logged. The house itself seems aware of this quiet activity, as though it leans closer to witness the careful rebellion tucked between the ledger and the inkwell. You notice a folded sheet in the corner of the desk. It contains a detailed diagram of the family's movements throughout the day, when the mother moves from parlor to staircase, when the father inspects the hearth, the intervals, when the children are left unattended. Every step is mapped, every pause timed. The son has created a record, not merely of space but of control, learning the rhythms of authority and discipline so that he can anticipate them, avoid them, or quietly subvert them. The quill rests near a small ink pot, its tip blackened and hardened from use. You can imagine the boy leaning close, carefully composing each line in the faint morning light, aware that a single slip could be discovered and punished. Victorian households valued propriety above expression, yet here, expression persists in secrecy, preserved in letters that might never leave the drawer but that contain a world he alone inhabits. Across the room, the chair bears an impression where he often sits, elbows tucked in, shoulders hunched slightly. Every movement, every gesture is measured to appear compliant. Even in repose, he is calculating, observing, plotting. The letters are his confidants, silent yet faithful, holding truths too fragile to share with the family, too dangerous to expose to servants. You step back from the desk, leaving the letters behind. The boy has returned to his routine, pacing softly, glancing at the window, noting the placement of chairs and the quiet shuffle of servant steps. Yet the correspondence remains a hidden archive of curiosity, observation, and subtle resistance. In this house, the heir learns not only obedience but discretion, and in the margins of these secret letters, he practices rebellion. The father's study is dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through tall windows and the faint flicker of a single gas lamp. Victorian households relied on strict hierarchies and unspoken codes, and in this home, the father's authority is absolute. Every gesture, every glance, every pause carries weight, creating an environment where obedience is demanded without words. The house itself seems to recognize his presence, stiffening in silence as he moves. You step into the room, noting the precise arrangement of objects. Ledgers stacked evenly, ink pots polished to a muted shine, and books aligned by height along the shelves. Each item reflects the same meticulous care that defines the father's approach to the household. Even the chair he favors at the desk bears a faint indentation, shaped by decades of disciplined posture, a silent witness to hours of calculation, judgment, and unseen observation. The son sits near the window, pretending to read while secretly watching the father's movements. Every adjustment of a book, every flick of the pen, every tilt of the head is measured and noted. Victorian children were expected to internalize the family's values, and the son has learned quickly that understanding the hidden rules of behavior is as important as learning arithmetic or Latin. His small hands clutch the edges of the desk, knuckles pale, as he imagines the silent consequences of any misstep. The daughter observes from across the room, seated with her posture perfect, hands folded and eyes lowered. She listens carefully, absorbing the subtleties of her father's presence, the unspoken corrections in his glance, the implied reprimands in the tilt of his head, the weight of expectation pressing into the air itself. Every movement in this household is monitored, and every rule spoken or unspoken is enforced with quiet rigor. The mother stands near the fireplace, hands pressed lightly together, the faintest tremor running through her fingers. She knows the consequences of failing to follow these hidden rules, and her composure is itself a form of obedience. Even her faint sighs are measured, quiet enough to avoid detection. Victorian etiquette demanded this suppression, teaching women to endure silently while projecting perfection, and she has learned the lesson well. On the desk lies a stack of letters the father has not yet opened, each marked with careful annotations and dates. These letters are more than correspondence. They are instruments of control. Decisions, expectations, warnings, and rewards are all encoded in paper, awaiting his judgment. Every household member lives in anticipation of his evaluation, learning the boundaries of behavior and the limits of acceptable expression. You notice a slight creak in the floorboards, and the father's eyes flick toward it, sharp and precise. The servants, invisible in the corners, move with quiet efficiency, understanding the silent authority and the consequences of misalignment. Each action, however small, is registered, weighed, and stored in the invisible ledger that governs the household. The father stands, moving to the window, his silhouette framed by the pale morning light. The house seems to exhale with him, adjusting to his rhythm. Victorian authority is often spoken of in terms of commands, but here it is pervasive, a force as tangible as the polished floors, the cold hearth, or the carefully arranged furniture. Every gesture teaches the family the rules of conduct, the limits of speech, and the weight of obedience. The father's hidden rules govern everything, unseen yet absolute. The front door closed with a soft, deliberate click, leaving the corridor empty, except for the faint echoes of footsteps that had crossed it months before. The son had been away, sent to a distant estate, a boarding school, or perhaps a relative's home, an absence meant to educate, to shape, to enforce obedience in the mold his father demanded. Now he has returned, and the house is different, as if it senses the subtle changes he carries back with him. You step into the corridor leading to his room. The floorboards creak underfoot, familiar and yet slightly altered, responding to the new rhythm he brings. Victorian homes absorbed presence like paper absorbs ink, and the boy's absence had left the walls quieter, heavier, waiting. His return does not announce itself loudly. It arrives in the small shifts, the tilt of a shoulder, the measured pause before stepping, the faint confidence in his gait. Inside his room, the differences are subtle but undeniable. His desk, once precise and organized, now bears traces of improvisation. Papers stacked irregularly, sketches layered atop ledgers, maps folded into shapes that suggest planning rather than strict copying. A compass, a few small books, and personal tokens lie scattered as though placed with intention rather than adherence. Victorian education prized conformity, yet here is evidence that he has learned to navigate, to observe, and to act independently. The bed is no longer perfectly made. Blankets are twisted in gentle disarray, pillows pushed to one side. The impression of restless nights is visible, a testament to a mind that continues to work and plan, even in sleep. A faint draught from the window ruffles the edges of his papers, carrying a scent of distant streets and colder air, a reminder that the world beyond these walls has left its mark. The daughter peers from her doorway, curiosity tempered with caution. She notices immediately. He moves with confidence she has rarely seen, speaks in tones subtly different, and carries an awareness that goes beyond the expectations enforced by their father. The mother observes from across the hall, hands folded, eyes sharp, aware that something fundamental has shifted. Victorian households valued stability, but here, the return of a child has altered the equilibrium. On the desk, a small box holds letters and notes the son had kept during his absence. Each document is a record of observation, reflection, and quiet defiance. Even the briefest sketch or notation is imbued with an understanding that extends beyond the rules of the house. He has returned not as a passive heir but as a subtle strategist, fully aware of the household's rhythm and ready to navigate it on his own terms. The father's study remains a looming presence nearby, but the son no longer approaches it with the same timid deference. Instead, he measures his steps, his movements precise, aware of the authority but no longer dominated by it. Victorian authority relies on compliance, yet the boy's return challenges it quietly, in ways that the house itself begins to register. As you step back into the corridor, the house exhales softly, acknowledging the change. The son has returned, carrying the world outside within him, and the household, patient and watchful, will never be quite the same again. The daughter's room is quiet, yet the stillness carries a weight heavier than the absence of sound alone. Victorian girls were taught to move delicately, speak softly, and conform wholly to the expectations of their parents and society. But this daughter, returning from lessons, trips abroad, or whispered encounters beyond the estate, carries a shift within her, subtle, deliberate, undeniable. She moves differently now, each gesture hinting at autonomy carefully learned and quietly asserted. You enter the room, noticing the small desk beneath the window. Her writing materials are spread across it in a way that seems intentional, journals stacked haphazardly, letters opened and folded again, sketches peeking from beneath volumes of etiquette and moral instruction. Victorian education prized compliance, but she has cultivated a silent rebellion in ink and graphite. Each line of writing and every sketch is a small assertion of agency, a demonstration that she can shape her world without breaking the household's fragile surface. The bed is unmade, pillows askew, quilt pushed aside as though she had left in a hurry. This room has become her refuge, her stage, and her laboratory for understanding the boundaries she can stretch without consequence. Even the window, slightly ajar, allows a rush of air that carries the scent of distant streets, hinting at experiences beyond these walls, a world she is beginning to claim for herself. A trunk at the foot of the bed is open, revealing clothing and objects that subtly diverge from family expectations. Lighter fabrics, daring colors, trinkets and keepsakes collected with discretion, all evidence of her exploration, of a personality quietly resisting the rigid mold of Victorian femininity. She has learned the art of concealment, presenting the proper exterior to the household while cultivating independence in hidden corners of her room. The father's study lies nearby, and though his presence is always felt, she navigates her space with careful awareness, understanding when to pause, when to appear obedient, when to deflect attention. The mother hovers at the edge of propriety, noting each deviation, yet bound by her own duties and expectations. Unable to intervene fully, Victorian households demanded the appearance of harmony, and her subtle acts of rebellion test that illusion without shattering it outright. On the walls, sketches and notes are pinned in a quiet network, maps of the estate, plans for excursions, coded reflections on observations and conversations. Each represents a deliberate step beyond what is permitted, small defiance practiced methodically. She has learned the rhythm of the house, the silent rules, and she bends them without breaking them. The daughter sits by the desk, pen in hand, pausing only when footsteps echo in the hall. Even under observation, she moves with intention, her actions carefully measured to assert autonomy while avoiding confrontation. Her rebellion is not loud, it is refined, deliberate, and powerful in its subtlety. By the window, she gazes outward, imagining streets and skies beyond this home. The room, once a chamber of constraint, has become her laboratory for thought, creativity, and control. The daughter has broken tradition quietly, patiently, and irrevocably, and the house, patient and observing, notes every small act of independence. The house feels different today. Years of expectation, obedience, and quiet endurance have compressed into its walls, floorboards, and ceiling beams, and now, finally, it exhales. Victorian households prided themselves on order, composure, and the invisible hierarchies that governed every gesture. Yet in this home, the last traces of rigid control loosen slightly, as if the structure itself recognizes the cumulative strain of decades of restraint. You step through the main corridor, noticing the subtle changes. The floorboards, worn with countless footsteps, creak with a softer tone, almost relieved. The portraits along the hallway, which once seemed to watch with exacting scrutiny, now hang in a quiet truce with the passing of time. Even the air feels less constricted, warmer in the spaces where shadows once pressed heavy, carrying the weight of unspoken fears. The children, now grown or on the cusp of their own independence, move with ease that would have been impossible months or years ago. The daughter, once confined by expectation and decorum, carries herself with quiet confidence, her gestures unrestrained, her eyes alert but unshackled. The son walks deliberately, aware of authority but no longer wholly subject to it, tracing patterns through the house that no longer demand rigid conformity. Victorian upbringing was meant to mold, to suppress, to discipline, yet here, subtle rebellion has taken root, and the house has absorbed the shift. The mother's fainting room remains closed, but a sense of relief hangs in its absence. She moves through the hall with steadier hands, shoulders less burdened by invisible chains. Her presence is lighter, freer, and the air around her hums with the quiet relief of endurance, no longer tested to breaking. The father, still measured and authoritative, allows the household's rhythm to flow with less intensity, recognizing that the strict weight of observation has softened. Even the servants, who have carried the secrets, observations, and burdens of the family for decades, sense the change. The corridors feel less tense, each step lighter, each glance freer. The hidden knowledge they bear no longer has to counterbalance oppressive authority. The equilibrium has shifted subtly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. In the attic, the whispered confessions remain, but they no longer press upon the house as heavily. Letters, sketches, and observations sit quietly, their owners no longer constrained by the rigid expectations of past years. The children, servants, and parents alike have all learned, adjusted, and endured, and the house finally acknowledges the endurance with its first breath of release. You stand at the threshold of the main hall, sensing the subtle pulse of a household that has been constrained and observed, measured and disciplined. For generations, the walls no longer carry the same oppressive weight. The floorboards no longer bear only tension. The air itself seems willing to bend and shift, to acknowledge the moments of quiet rebellion, growth, and patience that have unfolded beneath its rafters. The house exhales. It has carried its burdens, absorbed its secrets, endured its tensions, and now, at last, it breathes.